Good evening, pretty shiny peoples. A little bit early today, but I have a lot of cooking to do for the dogs later. Yes, my dogs are super spoiled. I got away with some tuna and peas this morning, but I have a lot of cooking to do this evening. So, in other news, I am probably more likely to stream this weekend than I have been the last couple of weeks. And if not, then it is likely that I will stream next weekend. Not just the book club stream, but just a stream to hang out and chat and all of that good stuff. Um, about whatever. It can be about the book, it doesn't have to be. Um, let's see. Before we start this book, I think it's far enough in the book that I don't think we'll get to it tonight. Actually, I'm like 100% sure we won't get to it tonight, and we probably won't get to it next week. But we'll probably get to it by week 3 or 4. Um, like I said, the coming books are longer, right? The first book was the shortest one. But so here's my predicament. I don't want to say too much about the character because I don't want to give her away. But there is a character that says the N word a lot of times. And not only does she say the N word a lot of times, she says N word bitch a lot of times. Um, it makes sense in the context of this character. However, I don't want to give people reasons to like come in here and start clipping me saying some crazy ass shit out of context, right? So I'm, hey, Tobin, I'm not quite sure what that's going to look like or how I'm going to address that. Um, so if any of you have any ideas, um, that would be great because as I said, I like it makes sense for her character and her character development, and I don't want to take that away from the character. Um, and the character is racist, but not towards black people. So it's a really weird thing, and I don't, yeah, I just don't want people clipping me saying like the N word or in bitch, like out of context. And so I forgot I was going to have to deal with that when I said I would read this series out loud. And now now that seems like a little bit stressful of a thing. So um I don't know how I'm going to address it, and I apologize ahead of time if the way I decide to address it detracts from the story in some way. But I really just don't need clips of me saying that, you know? So I don't know. I don't know. Again, if any of you have any ideas, I would be grateful to hear them. One moment, please. All right. Luckily or unluckily, I have a couple of weeks to figure it out. However, people who know me know that I'm a procrastinator. So, and I really don't have many ideas. I don't really have many ideas on how to address that. So, I don't know if I will figure it out, but I guess I'll have to, right? We'll we'll cross that bridge when we get to it, I suppose. Okay. So, Tonight we are starting The Drawing of the Three, which is book 2 in the Dark Tower series. And we're going to start with the prologue. I don't know how much you guys remember from where we left off last week. I thought it was pretty interesting. I like the way book 1 ends. Prologue of the Sailor. The gunslinger came awake from a confused dream which seemed to consist of a single image, that of the sailor in the tarot deck from which the man in black had dealt, or purported to deal, the gunslinger's own moaning future. He drowns, gunslinger, the man in black was saying, and no one throws out the line. The boy, Jake. But this was no nightmare. It was a good dream. It was good because he was the one drowning, and that meant he was not Roland at all, but Jake, and he found this a relief because it would be far better to drown as Jake than to live as himself. A man who had, for a cold dream, betrayed a child who had trusted him. Good, all right, I'll drown, he thought, listening to the roar of the sea. Let me drown. But this was not the sound of the open deeps. It was the grating sound of water with a throat full of stones. Was he the sailor? If so, why was land so close? And in fact, was he not on land? It felt as if freezing cold water doused his boots and ran up his legs to his crotch. His eyes flew open, and then what snapped out of the dream wasn't his freezing balls, which had suddenly shrunk to what felt like the size of walnuts, nor the horror to his right, but the thought of his guns. His guns, and even more important, his shells. Wet guns could be quickly disassembled, wiped dry, oiled, wiped dry again, oiled again, and reassembled. Wet shells, like wet matches, might or might not ever be usable again. The horror was a crawling thing, which must have been cast up by a previous wave. It dragged a wet, gleaming body laboriously along the sand. It was about 4 feet long and about 4 yards to the right. It regarded Roland with bleak eyes on stalks. Its long, serrated beak dropped open, and it began to make a noise that was weirdly like human speech. Plaintive, even desperate questions in an alien tongue. Did a chick? Did a chum? That a chum? That a chick? The gunslinger had seen lobsters. This wasn't one, although lobsters were the only things he had ever seen which this creature even vaguely resembled. It didn't seem afraid of him at all. The gunslinger didn't know if it was dangerous or not. He didn't care about his own mental confusion, his temporary inability to remember where he was or how he had gotten there, if he had actually caught the man in black, or if all of that had been a dream. He only knew he had to get away from the water before it could drown his shells. He heard the grinding, swelling roar of water and looked from the creature. It had stopped and was holding up claws with which it had been pulling itself along, looking absurdly like a boxer assuming his opening stance, which Court had taught them, was called the honor stance, to the incoming breaker with its curdle of foam. It hears the wave, the gunslinger thought. Whatever it is, it's got ears. He tried to get up, but his legs, too numb to feel, buckled under him. I'm still dreaming, he thought. But even in his current confused state, this was a belief much too tempting to really be believed. He tried to get up again, almost made it, then fell back. The wave was breaking. There was no time again. He had to settle for moving in much the same way the creature on his right seemed to move. He dug in with both his hands and dragged his butt up the stony shingle away from the wave. He didn't progress enough to avoid the wave entirely, but he got far enough for his purpose. The wave buried nothing but his boots. It reached almost to his knees and then retreated. Perhaps the first one didn't go as far as I thought. Perhaps. There was half a moon in the sky. A caul of mist covered it, but it shed enough light for him to see the holsters were too dark. The guns, at least, had suffered a wetting. It was impossible to tell how bad it had been, or if either Either the shells currently in the cylinders or those in the crossed gun belts had also been wetted. Before checking, he had to get away from the water. Had to. Dada chuck? This was much closer. In his worry over the water, he had forgotten the creature the water had cast up. He looked around and saw it was now only 4 feet away. Its claws were buried in the stone and shell littered sand of the shingle, pulling its body along. It lifted its meaty, serrated body, making it momentarily resemble a scorpion, but Roland could see no stinger at the end of its body. Another grinding roar, this one much louder. The creature immediately stopped and raised its claws into its own peculiar version of the honor stance again. This wave was bigger. Roland began to drag himself up the slope of the strand again, and when he put out his hands, the clawed creature moved with the speed of which its previous movements had not even hinted. The gunslinger felt a bright flare of pain in his right hand, but there was no time to think about that now. He pushed with the heel of his soggy boots, clawed with the hands, and managed to get away from the wave. Did it chick? The monstrosity inquired in its plaintive, "Won't you help me? Can't you see I'm desperate?" voice. And Roland saw the stumps of the first and second fingers of his right hand disappearing into the creature's jagged beak. It lunged again, and Roland lifting his dipping right hand just in time to save his remaining 2 fingers. Dum-a-chum, that-a-chap. The gunslinger staggered to his feet. The thing tore open his dripping jeans, tore through a boot whose old leather was soft but as tough as iron, and took a chunk of meat from Roland's lower calf. He drew with his right hand and realized 2 of the fingers needed to perform this ancient killing operation were gone, only when the revolver thumped to the sand. The monstrosity snapped at it greedily. "No, bastard!" Roland snarled and kicked it. It was like kicking a block of rock, one that bit. It tore away the end of Roland's right boot, tore away most of his great toe, tore the boot itself from his foot. The gunslinger bent, picked up his revolver, dropped it, cursed, and finally managed. What had once been a thing so easy it didn't even bear thinking about had suddenly become a trick akin to juggling. The creature was crouched on the gunslinger's boot, tearing at it as it asked its garbled questions. A wave rolled to the beach, the foam which curdled its top looking pallid and dead in the netted light of the half moon. The lobstrosity stopped working at the boot and raised its claw in that boxer's pose. Roland drew with his left hand and pulled the trigger 3 times. Click, click, click. Now he knew about the shells in the chambers, at least. He holstered the left gun. To holster the right, he had to turn its barrel downward with his left hand and then let it drop into its place. Blood slimed the worn iron wood hand grips. Blood spotted the holster and the old jeans to which the holster was thong tied. It poured from the stumps where his fingers used to be. His mangled right foot was still too numb to hurt, but his right hand was a bellowing fire. The ghost of talented and long trained fingers were already decomposing in the digestive juices of that thing's guts. Screamed that they were still there, that they were still burning. I see serious problems ahead, the gunslinger thought remotely. The wave retreated. The monstrosity lowered its claws, tore a fresh hole in the gunslinger's boots, and then decided the wearer had been a good deal more tasty than this bit of skin it had somehow sloughed off. "That a chum?" it asked, and scurried toward him with ghastly speed. The gunslinger retreated on legs he could barely feel, realizing that the creature must have some intelligence. It had approached him cautiously, perhaps from a long way down the strand, not sure where he was or of what he might be capable. If the dousing wave hadn't woken him, the thing would have torn off his face while he was still deep in his dream. Now it had decided he was not only tasty, but vulnerable, easy prey. It was almost upon him, a thing 4 feet long and a foot high, a creature which might weigh as much as 70 pounds, and which was as single-mindedly carnivorous as David, the hawk he had as a boy, but without David's dim vestige of loyalty. The gunslinger's left boot heel struck a rock jutting from the sand, and he tottered on the edge of falling. "That a chuck?" the thing asked, solicitously. It seemed and peered at the gunslinger from its stalky, waving eyes as its claws reached, and then a wave came, and the claws went up again in the honor stance. Yet now they wavered the slightest bit, and the gunslinger realized that it responded to the sound of the wave, and now the sound was, for it at least, fading a bit. He stepped backward over the rock, then bent down as the wave broke over the shingle with its grinding roar. His head was inches from the insectile face of the creature. One of its claws might easily have slashed the eyes from his face, but its trembling claws, so like clenched fists, remained raised to either side of its parrot like beak. The gunslinger reached for the stone over which he had nearly fallen. It was large, half buried in the sand, and his mutilated right hand howled as bits of dirt and sharp edges of pebble ground into the open, bleeding flesh, but he yanked the rock free and raised it, his lips pulled away from his teeth. Dada, the monstrosity began, its claws lowering and opening as the wave broke and its sound receded. The gunslinger swept the rock down upon it with all his strength. There was a crunching noise as the creature's segmented back broke. It lashed wildly beneath the rock, its rear half lifting and thudding, lifting and thudding. Its interrogatories became buzzing exclamations of pain. Its claws opened and shut upon nothing. Its maw of a beak gnashed up clots of sand and pebbles. And yet, as another wave broke, it tried to raise its claws again, and when it did, the gunslinger stepped on its head with his remaining boot. There was a sound like many small, dry twigs being broken. Thick fluid burst from beneath the heel of Roland's boot, splashing in two directions. It looked black. The thing arched and wriggled in a frenzy. The gunslinger planted his boot harder. A wave came. The monstrosity's claws rose an inch, 2 inches, trembled, and then fell, twitching open and shut. The gunslinger removed his boot. The thing's serrated beak, which had separated 2 fingers and 1 toe from his living body, slowly opened and closed. One antenna lay broken on the sand, the other trembled meaninglessly. The gunslinger stamped down again and again. He kicked the rock aside with a grunt of effort and marched along the right side of the monstrosity's body, stamping methodically with his left boot, smashing its shell, squeezing its pale guts out onto the dark gray sand. It was dead, but he meant to have his way with it all the same. He had never, in all his long, strange time, been so fundamentally hurt, and it had all been so unexpected. He kept on until he saw the tip of one of his own fingers in the dead thing's sour mash, saw the white dust beneath the nail from the Golgotha where he and the man in black had held their long palaver, and then he looked aside and vomited. The gunslinger walked back toward the water like a drunken man, holding his wounded hand against his shirt, looking back from time to time to make sure the thing wasn't still alive, like some tenacious wasp you swat again and again, still twitching, stunned but not dead, to make sure it wasn't following, asking its alien questions in its deadly, despairing voice. Halfway down the shingle, he stood and swayed, looking at the place where he had been, remembering. He had fallen asleep, apparently, just below the high tide line. He grabbed his purse and his torn boots. In the moon's glabrous light, he saw other creatures of the same type, and in the caesura between one wave and the next, heard their questioning voices. The gunslinger retreated a step at a time, retreated until he reached the grassy edge of the shingle. There he sat down and did all he knew to do. He sprinkled the stumps of his fingers and toes with the last of his tobacco to stop the bleeding, sprinkled it thick, in spite of the new stinging. His missing great toe had joined the chorus, and then he only sat, sweating in the chill, wondering about infection, wondering how he would make his way in the world with 2 fingers on his right hand gone. When it came to the guns, both hands had been equal, but in all other things, his right had ruled, wondering if the thing had some poison in its bite which might already be working its way into him, wondering if morning would ever come. Chapter 1. The Door. 3. This is the number of your fate. 3. Yes, 3 is mystic. 3 stands at the heart of the mantra. Which 3? The first is dark haired. He stands on the brink of robbery and murder. A demon has infested him. The name of the demon is heroin. Which demon is that? I know it not, even from the nursery stories. He tried to speak, but his voice was gone. The voice of the oracle, star slut, whore of the winds, both were gone. He saw a card fluttering down from nowhere to nowhere, turning and turning in the lazy dark. On it, a baboon grinned from over the shoulder of a young man with dark hair. Its disturbingly human fingers were buried so deep in the young man's neck that their tips had disappeared in flesh. Looking more closely, the gunslinger saw the baboon held a whip in one of those clutching, strangling hands. The face of the ridden man seemed to writhe in a wordless terror. The prisoner, the man in black, who had once been a man the gunslinger trusted, a man named Walter, whispered chummily. A trifle upsetting, isn't he? A trifle upsetting, a trifle upsetting, a trifle. The gunslinger snapped awake, waving at something with his mutilated hand, sure that in a moment one of the monstrous shelled things from the western sea would drop on him, desperately inquiring in its foreign tongue as it pulled his face off his skull. Instead, a seabird, attracted by the glister of the morning sun on the buttons of his shirt, wheeled away with a frightened squawk. Roland sat up. His hand throbbed wretchedly, endlessly. His right foot did the same. Both fingers and toe continued to insist they were there. The bottom half of his shirt was gone. What was left resembled a ragged vest. He had used one piece to bind his hand and the other to bind his foot. Go away, he told the absent parts of his body. You are ghosts now. Go away. It helped a little. Not much, but a little. They were ghosts, all right, but lively ghosts. The gunslinger ate jerky. His mouth wanted it little, his stomach less, but he insisted. When it was inside him, he felt a little stronger. There was not much left, though. He was nearly up against it. Yet things needed to be done. He rose unsteadily to his feet and looked about. Birds swooped and dived, but the world seemed to belong to only him and them. The monstrosities were gone. Perhaps they were nocturnal, perhaps tidal. At the moment it seemed to make no difference. The sea was enormous, meeting the horizon at the misty blue point that was impossible to determine. For a long moment the gunslinger forgot his agony in his contemplation. He had never seen such a body of water. He had heard of it, in children's stories, of course, had even been assured by his teachers, some at least, that it existed. But to actually see it, this immensity, this amazement of water after years of arid land was difficult to accept, difficult to even see. He looked at it for a long time, enwrapt, making himself see it, temporarily forgetting his pain and wonder. But it was morning, and there were still things to be done. He felt for the jawbone in his right back pocket, careful to lead with the palm of his right hand, not wanting the stubs of his fingers to encounter it if it was still there, changing that hand's ceaselessly sobbing to screams. It was, all right. Next, he clumsily unbuckled his gun belts and laid them on a sunny rock. He removed the guns, swung the chambers out, and removed the useless shells. He threw them away. A bird settled on the bright gleam tossed back by one of them. He picked it up in its beak, then dropped it and flew away. The guns themselves must be tended to, should have been tended to before this, but since no gun in this world or any other was more than a club without ammunition, he laid the gun belts themselves over his lap before doing anything else and carefully ran his left hand over the leather. Each of them was damp from buckle and clasped to the point where the belts would cross his hips. From that point they seemed dry. He carefully removed each shell from the dry portions of the belts. His right hand kept trying to do this job, insisting on forgetting its reduction in spite of the pain, and he found himself returning to his knee again and again, like a dog too stupid or fractious to heel. In his distant pain, he came close to swatting it once or twice. I see serious problems ahead, he thought again. He put these shells, hopefully still good, in a pile that was dishearteningly small. 20. Of those, a few would almost certainly misfire. He could depend on none of them. He removed the rest and put them in another pile. 37. Well, you weren't heavily loaded anyway, he thought, but he recognized the difference between 57 live rounds and what might be 20, or 10, or 5, or none, or none. He put the dubious shells in a second pile. He still had his purse. That was one thing. He put it in his lap and then slowly disassembled his guns and performed the ritual of cleaning. By the time he was finished, 2 hours had passed, and his pain was so intense his head reeled with it. Conscious thought had become difficult. He wanted to sleep. He had never wanted that more in his life, but in the service of duty, there was never any acceptable reason for denial. Court, he said in a voice that he couldn't recognize, and laughed dryly. Slowly, slowly, he reassembled his revolvers and loaded them with the shells he presumed to be dry. When the job was done, he held the one made for his left hand, cocked it, and then slowly lowered the hammer again. He wanted to know, yes, wanted to know if there would be a satisfying report when he squeezed the trigger, or only another of those useless clicks. But a click would mean nothing, and a report would only reduce 20 to 19, or 9, or 3, or none. He tore away another piece of his shirt, put the other shells, the ones which had been wetted, in it, and tied it. Using his left hand and his teeth, he put them in his purse. Sleep, his body demanded. Sleep, you must sleep, now, before dark. There's nothing left, you're used up. He tottered to his feet and looked up and down the deserted strand. It was the color of an undergarment which had gone a long time without washing, littered with seashells which had no color. Here and there large rocks protruded from the gross-grained sand, and those were covered with guano and the older layers, the yellow of ancient teeth, the fresher splotches white. The high tide line was marked with drying kelp. He could see pieces of his right boot and his water skins lying near that line. He thought it was almost a miracle that the skins hadn't been washed out to sea by high surging waves. Walking slowly, limping exquisitely, the gunslinger made his way to where they were. He picked up one of them and shook it by his ear. The other was empty. This one still had a little water left in it. Most would not have been able to tell the difference between the two, but the gunslinger knew each just as well as a mother knows which of her identical twins is which. He had been traveling with these water skins for a long, long time. Water sloshed inside. That was good, a gift. Either the creature which had attacked him or any of the others could have torn this or the other open with one casual bite or slice of the claw. But none had, and the tide had spared it. Of the creature itself there was no sign, although the two of them had finished far above the tide line. Perhaps other predators had taken it. Perhaps its own kind had given it a burial at sea, as the elephants, giant creatures of whom he had heard in childhood stories, were reputed to bury their own dead. He lifted the water skin with his left elbow, drank deeply, and felt some strength come back into him. The right boot was of course ruined, but then he felt a spark of hope. The foot itself was intact, scarred but intact, and it might be possible to cut the other down to match it, to make something which would last at least a while. Faintness stole over him. He fought it, but his knees unhinged and he sat down, stupidly biting his tongue. You won't fall unconscious, he told himself grimly. Not here, not where another of those things can come back tonight and finish the job. So he got to his feet and tied the empty skin about his waist. But he had only gotten 20 yards back toward the place where he had left his guns and purse when he fell down again, half fainting. He lay there a while, one cheek pressed against the sand, the edge of his seashell biting against the edge of his jaw, almost deep enough to draw blood. He managed to drink from the water skin, and then he crawled back to the place where he had awakened. There was a Joshua tree 20 yards up the slope. It was stunted, but it would offer at least some shade. To Roland, the 20 yards looked like 20 miles. Nonetheless, he laboriously pushed what remained of his possessions into that little puddle of shade, He lay there with his head in the grass, already fading toward what could be sleep, or unconsciousness, or death. Not noon, but the size of the puddle of shade in which he rested said noon was close. He held on a moment longer, turning his right arm over and bringing it close to his eyes, looking for the telltale red lines of infection, of some poison seeping steadily toward the middle of him. The palm of his hand was dull red. Not a good sign. I jerk off left-handed, he thought. At least that's something. Then darkness took him, and he slept for the next 16 hours, with the sound of the western sea pounding ceaselessly in his dreaming ears. When the gunslinger awoke again, the sea was dark, but there was a faint light in the sky to the east. Morning was on its way. He sat up, and waves of dizziness almost overcame him. He bent his head and waited. When the faintness had passed, he looked at his hand. He was infected, all right. A telltale red swelling that spread up the palm into the wrist. It stopped there, but already he could see the faint beginnings of other red lines, which would lead eventually to his heart and kill him. He felt hot and feverish. I need medicine, he thought, but there is no medicine here. He had come this far just to die, then? He would not. And if he were to die in spite of this determination, he would die on his way to the tower. How remarkable you are, gunslinger, the man in black tittered inside his head. How indomitable, how romantic in your stupid obsession. Fuck you, he croaked, and drank. Not much water left either. There was a whole sea in front of him for all the good it could do him. Water. Water everywhere. But not a drop to drink. Never mind. He buckled on his gun belts, tied them. This was a process which took so long that before he was done, the first faint light of dawn had brightened to the day's actual prologue and then tried to stand up. He was not convinced he could do it until it was done. Holding to the Joshua tree with his left hand, he scooped up the not quite empty water skin with his right arm and slung it over his shoulder. Then his purse. When he straightened, the faintness washed over him again, and he put his head down, waiting, willing. The faintness passed. Walking with the weaving, wavering steps of a man in the last stages of ambulatory drunkenness, the gunslinger made his way back down to the Strand. He stood looking at the ocean as dark as mulberry wine, and then took the last of his jerky from his purse. He ate half, and this time both mouth and stomach accepted a little more willingly. He turned and ate the other half as he watched the sun come up over the mountains where Jake had died, first seeming to catch on the cruel and treeless teeth of those peaks, then rising above them. Roland held his face to the sun, closed his eyes, and smiled. Then he ate the rest of his jerky. He thought, very well, I am now a man with no food, with 2 less fingers and 1 less toe than I was born with. I am a gunslinger with shells which may not fire. I am sickened from a monster's bite and have no medicine. I have a day's water, if I'm lucky. I may be able to walk perhaps a dozen miles if I press myself to last extremity. I am, in short, a man on the edge of everything. Which way should he walk? He had come from the east. He had not walked west without the powers of a saint or savior. That left north and south. North. That was the answer his heart told. There was no question in it. North. The gunslinger began to walk. He walked for 3 hours. He fell twice, and the second time he did not believe he would be able to get up again. Then a wave came toward him, close enough to make him remember his guns, and he was up before he knew it, standing on legs that quivered like stilts. He thought he had managed about 4 miles in those 3 hours. Now the sun was growing hot, but not hot enough to explain the way his head pounded, or the sweat pouring down his face, nor the breeze from the sea strong enough to explain the sudden fits of shuddering which sometimes gripped him, making his body lump into goose flesh and his teeth chatter. Fever, gunslinger, the man in black tittered. What's left inside you has been touched to fire. The red lines of infection were more pronounced now. They had marched upward from his right wrist halfway to his elbow. He made another mile and drained his water bag dry. He tied it around his waist with the other. The landscape was monotonous and unpleasing. The sea to his right, the mountains to his left, the gray, shell littered sand under the feet of his cut down boots. The waves came and went. He looked for the lobstrosities and saw none. He walked out of nowhere toward nowhere, a man from another time who, it seemed, had reached a point of pointless ending. Shortly before noon, he fell again and knew he could not get up. This was the place, then. Here. This was the end after all. On his hands and knees, he raised his head like a groggy fighter, and some distance ahead, perhaps a mile, perhaps 3, it was difficult to judge distances along the unchanging reach of the strand with the fever working inside him, making his eyeballs pulse in and out. He saw something new, something which stood upright on the beach. What was it? 3. Didn't matter. 3 is the number of your fate. The gunslinger managed to get to his feet again. He croaked something, some plea which only the circling seabirds heard, and how happy they would be to gobble my eyes from my head, he thought. How happy to have such a tasty bit. And walked on, weaving more seriously now, leaving tracks behind him that were weird loops and swoops. He kept his eyes on whatever it was that stood on the strand ahead. When his hair fell in his eyes, he brushed it aside. It seemed to grow no closer. The sun reached the roof of the sky where it seemed to remain far too long. Roland imagined he was in the desert again, somewhere between the last outlander's hut. The musical fruit, the more you eat, the more you. And the way station where the boy, your Isaac, had awaited his coming. His knees buckled, straightened again. When his hair fell in his eyes once more, he did not bother to push it back, did not have the strength to push it back. He looked at the object, which now cast a narrow shadow, back toward the upland, and kept walking. He could make it out now, fever or no fever. It was a door. Less than a quarter of a mile from it, Roland's knees buckled again, and this time he could not stiffen their hinges. He fell. His right hand dragged across gritty sand and shells, and the stumps of his fingers screamed as fresh scabs were scored away. The stumps began to bleed again. So he crawled with the steady rush, roar, and retreat of the western sea in his ears. He used his elbows and his knees, digging grooves in the sand above the twists of dirty green kelp which marked the high tide line. He supposed the wind was still blowing. It must be, for the chills continued to whip through his body. But the only wind he could hear was the harsh gale which gusted in and out of his own lungs. The door grew closer, closer. At last, around 3 o'clock of that long, delirious day, with his shadow beginning to grow long on his left, he reached it. He sat back on his haunches and regarded it wearily. It stood 6.5 feet high and appeared to be made of solid ironwood, although the nearest ironwood tree must grow 700 miles or more from here. The doorknob looked as if it were made of gold, and it was filigreed with the design which the gunslinger finally recognized. It was the grinning face of the baboon. There was no keyhole in the knob above it or below it. The door had hinges, but they were fastened to nothing, or so it seems, the gunslinger thought. This is a mystery, a most marvelous mystery, but does it really matter? You are dying. Your own mystery, the only one that really matters to any man or woman in the end, approaches. All the same, it did seem to matter. This door. This door where no door should be. It simply stood there on the gray strand, 20 feet above the high tide line, seemingly as eternal as the sea itself, now casting the slanted shadow of its thickness towards the east as the sun westered. Written upon it in black letters, 2/3 of the way up, written in the high speech, were 2 words: The prisoner. A demon has infested him. The name of the demon is heroin. The gunslinger could hear a low, droning noise. At first, he thought it must be the wind or a sound in his own feverish head, but he became more and more convinced that the sound was the sound of motors and that it was coming from behind the door. Open it then. It's not locked. You know it's not locked. On that note, guys, I am so, so sorry. But this little puppy has been waiting patiently, and I will be right back. Go refill your drinks, grab snacks, do whatever you're gonna do. So sorry. So, funny thing, my foot fell asleep, and when I got up to help the puppy, I almost fell flat on my face. But I have returned with some water. My apologies, guys. And we're back. Open it then. It's not locked. You know it's not locked. Instead, he tottered gracelessly to his feet and walked above the door and around to the other side. There was no other side, only the dark gray strand stretching back and back, only the waves, the shells, the high tide line, the marks of his own approach, boot prints and holes that had been made by his elbows. He looked again and his eyes widened a little. The door wasn't here, but its shadow was. He started to put out his right hand. Oh, it was so slow learning its new place. It was what was left of his life. Dropped it and raised his left instead. He groped, feeling for hard resistance. If I felt it, I'll knock on nothing, the gunslinger thought. That would be an interesting thing to do before dying. His hand entered thin air far past the place where the door, even if visible, should have been. Nothing to knock on. And the sound of motors, if that's what it really had been, was gone. Now there was just the wind, the waves, and the sick buzzing inside his head. The gunslinger walked slowly back to the other side of what wasn't there, already thinking it had been a hallucination to start with. He stopped. At one moment, he had been looking west at an uninterrupted view of a gray, rolling wave, and then his view was interrupted by the thickness of the door. He could see its key plate, which also looked like gold, with the latch protruding from it like a stubby metal tongue. Roland moved his head an inch to the north, and the door was gone, moved it back to where it had been, and it was there again. It did not appear, it was just there. He walked all the way around and faced the door, swaying. He could walk around on the seaside, but he was convinced that the same thing would happen, only this time he would fall down. I wonder if I could go through it from the nothing side. Oh, there were all sorts of things to wonder about, but the truth was simple. Here stood this door alone on an endless stretch of beach, and it was for only one of two things: opening or leaving closed. The gunslinger realized with dim humor that maybe he wasn't dying quite as fast as he thought. If he had been, would he feel this scared? He reached out and grasped the doorknob with his left hand. Neither the deadly cold of metal nor the thin, fiery heat of the runes engraved upon it surprised him. He turned the knob. The door opened toward him when he pulled it. Of all the things he might have expected, this was not any of them. The gunslinger looked, froze, uttered the first scream of terror in his adult life, and slammed the door. There was nothing for it to bang shut on, but it banged shut just the same, sending seabirds screeching up from the rocks on which they had perched to watch him. What he had seen was the earth from some high, impossible distance in the sky, miles up it seemed. He had seen the shadows of clouds lying upon the earth, floating across it like dreams. He had seen what an eagle might see if one could fly thrice as high as any eagle could. To step through such a door would be to fall, screaming, for what might be minutes, and to end up by driving oneself deep into the earth. No, you saw more. He considered it as he sat stupidly on the sand in front of the closed door, with his wounded hand in his lap. The first faint traceries had appeared above his elbow now. The infection would reach his heart soon enough. No doubt about that. There was the voice of Court in his head. Listen to me, maggots. Listen for your lives, for that's what it could mean some day. You never see all that you see. One of the things they send you to me for is to show you what you don't see in what you don't see when you're scared, or fighting, or running, or fucking. No man sees all that he sees. Before you're gunslingers, those of you who don't go west, that is, you'll see more in one single glance than some men see in a lifetime, and some of what you don't see in that glance you'll see afterwards in the eye of your memory. If you live long enough to remember, that is, because the difference between seeing and not seeing can be the difference between living and dying. Seen the earth from this huge height, and it had somehow been more dizzying and distorting than the vision of growth which had come upon him shortly before the ending of his time with the man in black. Because what he had seen through the door had been no vision, and what little remained of his attention had registered the fact that the land he was seeing was neither desert nor sea, but some green place of incredible lushness with in, in, interstices of water made him think it was a swamp, but what little remained of your attention, the voice of Court mimicked savagely. You saw more. Yes. He had seen white edges. Bravo, Roland, Court cried in his mind, and Roland seemed to feel the swat of that hard, callous hand. He winced. He had been looking through a window. The gunslinger stood with an effort, reached forward, felt cold and burning lines of thin heat against his palm, and he opened the door again. The view he had expected, that view of the earth from some horrendous, unimaginable height, was gone. He was looking at words he didn't understand. He almost understood them. It was as if the great letters had been twisted. Above the words was a picture of a horseless vehicle, a motor car of some sort, which had supposedly filled the world before it moved on. Suddenly he thought of the things Jake had said when, at the way station, the gunslinger had hypnotized him. This horseless vehicle with a woman wearing a fur stole laughing beside it could be whatever had run Jake over in that strange other world. This is that other world, the gunslinger thought. Suddenly, the view. It did not change, it moved. The gunslinger wavered on his feet, feeling vertigo and a touch of nausea. The words and the pictures descended, and now he saw an aisle with a double row of seats on the far side. A few were empty, but there were men, most of them, men in strange dress. He supposed they were suits, but he had never seen any like them before. The thing around their necks could likewise be ties or cravats, but he'd seen none like those either, and so far as he could tell, not one of them was armed. He saw no dagger nor sword, let alone a gun. What kind of trusting sheep were these? Some read papers covered with tiny words broken here and there with pictures, while others wrote on papers with pens of a sort the gunslinger had never seen. But the pens mattered little to him. It was the paper. He lived in a world where paper and gold were valued in equivalency. He had never seen so much paper in his life. Even now, one of the men tore a sheet from the yellow pad which lay upon his lap and crumpled it into a ball, although he had only written on the top half of one side and not at all on the other. The gunslinger was not too sick to feel a twinge of horror and outrage at some unnatural profligacy. Sorry. Beyond the men was a curved white wall and row of windows. A few of these were covered by some sort of shutters, but he could see blue sky beyond others. Now a woman approached the doorway, a woman wearing what looked like a uniform, but of no sort Roland had ever seen. It was bright red, and part of it was pants. He could see the place where her legs became her crotch. This was nothing he had ever seen on a woman who was not undressed. She came so close to the door that Roland thought she would walk through, and he blundered back a step, luckily not to fall. She looked at him with the practiced solicitude of a woman who is at once a servant and no one's mistress but her own. This did not interest the gunslinger. What interested him was that her expression never changed. It was not the way you expected a woman, anybody for that matter, to look at a dirty, swaying, exhausted man with revolvers crisscrossed on his hips, a blood soaked rag wrapped around his right hand, and jeans which looked as if they'd been worked on with some sort of buzzsaw. Would you like? The woman in red asked. There was more, but the gunslinger didn't understand exactly what it meant. Food or drink, he thought. That red cloth. It was not cotton. Silk? It looked like silk, but gin? A voice answered. The gunslinger understood that. Suddenly he understood much more. It wasn't a door. It was eyes. Insane as it might seem, he was looking at part of a carriage that flew through the sky. He was looking through someone's eyes. Whose? But he knew. He was looking through the eyes of the prisoner. Eddie Dean. As if to confirm this idea, mad as it was, what the gunslinger was looking at through the doorway suddenly rose and slid sidewards. The view turned, that feeling of vertigo again, a feeling of standing still on a plate with wheels under it. A plate with hands he could not see moved this way and that. Let me find out why they are barking so consistently. Again, my apologies. Okay, sorry about that. No guarantees they won't start again. Okay. Uh, the view turned, that feeling of vertigo again, a feeling of standing still on a plate with wheels under it, a plate which hands he could not see moved this way and that, and then the aisle was flowing past the edges of the doorway. He passed a place where several women, all dressed in the same red uniforms, stood. This was a place of steel things, and he would have liked to make the moving view stop in spite of his pain and exhaustion so he could see what the steel things were. Machines of some sort. One looked like a bit like an oven. The army woman he had already seen was pouring the gin which the voice had requested. The bottle she poured from was very small. It was glass. The vessel she was pouring it into looked like glass, but the gunslinger didn't think it actually was. What the doorway showed had moved along before he could see more. There was another of those dizzying turns, and he was looking at a metal door. There was a lighted sign in the small oblong. This word the gunslinger could read. Vacant, it said. The view slid down a little. A hand entered it from the right of the door the gunslinger was looking through and grasped the doorknob of the door the gunslinger was looking at. He saw the cuff of a blue shirt, slightly pulled back to reveal crisp curls of black hair, long fingernails, a ring on one of them with a jewel set into it that might have been a ruby or a fire dim or a piece of trumpery trash. The gunslinger rather thought it the last. It was too big and vulgar to be real. The metal door swung open, and the gunslinger was looking into the strangest privy he had ever seen. It was all metal. The edges of the metal door flowed past the edges of the door on the beach. The gunslinger heard the sound of it being closed and latched. He was spared another of those giddy spins, so he supposed the man through whose eyes he was watching must have reached behind himself to lock himself in. Then the view did turn, not all the way round, but half, and he was looking into a mirror, seeing a face he had not seen once before on a tarot card. The same dark eyes and spill of dark hair. The face was calm but pale, and in the eyes through which he saw now reflected back at him, Roland saw some of the dread and horror of that baboon-ridden creature on the tarot card. The man was shaking. He's sick, too. Then he remembered the Nort, the weed-eater in Tull. He thought of the Oracle. A demon has infested him. The gunslinger suddenly thought he might know what heroin was after all. Something like the devil's grass. Trifle upsetting, isn't he? Without thought, with the simple resolve that had made him the last of them all, the last to continue marching on and on long after Cuthbert and the others had died or given up, committed suicide or treachery, or simply recanted the whole idea of the tower, with a single-minded and incurious resolve that had driven him across the desert in all the years before the desert in the wake of the man in black, the gunslinger stepped through the doorway. Eddie ordered a gin and tonic. Maybe not such a good idea to be going into New York customs drunk, and he knew once he got started he would keep on going, but he had to have something. When you gotta get down and you can't find the elevator, Henry had told him once, you gotta do it any way you can, even if it's only with a shovel. Then, after he'd given his order and the stewardess had left, he started to feel like he was maybe going to vomit. Not for sure going to vomit, only maybe. But it was better to be safe. Going through customs with a pound of pure cocaine under each armpit with gin on your breath was not so good. Going through customs that way with puke drying on your pants would be a disaster. So better to be safe. The feeling would probably pass. It usually did, but better to be safe. Trouble was, he was going to Cool Turkey. Cool, not cold. More words of wisdom from the great sage and eminent junkie, Henry Dean. They had been sitting on the penthouse balcony of the Regency Tower, not quite on the nod, but edging toward it. The sun warm on their faces, done up so good back in the good old days, when Eddie had just started to snort the stuff and Henry himself had yet to pick up his first needle. Everybody talks about going cold turkey, Henry said, but before you get there, you gotta go cool turkey. And Eddie, stoned out of his mind, had crackled madly because he knew exactly what Henry was talking about. Henry, however, had not so much as cracked a smile. In some ways, cool turkey's worse than cold turkey, Henry said. At least when you make it to cold turkey, you know you're going to puke. You know you're going to shake. You know you're going to start and sweat until it feels like you're drowning in it. Cool turkey is like the curse of expectations. Eddie remembered asking Henry what you call it when a needle freak, which in those dim dead days, which must have been all of 16 months ago, they had both solemnly assured themselves they would never become, got a hot shot. You call that baked turkey, Henry had replied promptly, and then he had looked surprised, the way a person does when he'd said something that turned out to be a lot funnier than he actually thought it would be. And they looked at each other, and they were both howling with laughter and clutching each other. Baked turkey. Pretty funny. Not so funny now. Eddie walked up the aisle past the gallery to head, checked the sign, vacant, and opened the door. Hey, Henry. Oh, great sage and eminent junkie big brother. While we're on the subject of our feathered friends, you want to hear my definition of cooked goose? That's when the customs guy at Kennedy decides there's something a little funny about the way you look, or it's one of those days when they got the dogs with the PhD noses out there instead of at Port Authority. and they all start to bark and pee all over the floor, and it's you they're all just about strangling themselves in their choke chains trying to get to. And after the custom guys toss all your luggage, they take you into the little room and ask you if you'd mind taking off your shirt. And you'd say, yeah, I sure would. I'd mind like hell. I'd pick up a little cold down in the Bahamas, and the air conditioning in here's real high, and I'm afraid if it might turn into pneumonia. And they say, oh, is that so? Do you always sweat like that when the air conditioning's too high, Mr. Dean? You do? Well, excuse us all to hell. Now do it. And you do it, and they say maybe you better take off the t-shirt too, because they look like maybe you've got some kind of medical problem, buddy. Those bulges under your pits look like maybe they could be some kind of lymphatic tumors or something, and you don't even bother to say anything else. It's like a center fielder who doesn't even bother to chase the ball when it's hit a certain way. He just turns around and watches it go into the upper deck, because when it's gone, it's gone. So you take off the t-shirt and, hey, looky here, you're some lucky kid. Those aren't tumors, unless what you might call tumors on the corpus of society. Those things look more like a couple of baggies held there with scotch strapping tape. By the way, don't worry about that smell, son. That's just a goose. It's cooked. He reached behind him and pulled the locking knob. The lights in the head brightened. The sound of the motors was a soft drone. He turned toward the mirror, wanting to see how bad he looked, and suddenly a terrible, pervasive feeling swept over him. The feeling of being watched. Hey, come on. Quit it, he thought uneasily. You're supposed to be the most unparanoid guy in the world. That's why they sent you. That's why. But it suddenly seemed those were not only his eyes in the mirror. Not Eddie Dean's hazel, almost green eyes that had melted so many hearts and allowed him to part so many pretty sets of legs during the last third of his 21 years. Not his eyes, but those of a stranger, not hazel, but a blue the color of fading Levi's. Eyes that were chilly, precise, unexpected marbles of calibration. Bombardier's eyes. Reflected in them, he clearly saw, a seagull swooping down over a breaking wave and snatching something from it. He had time to think, what in God's name is this shit? And then he knew it wasn't going to pass. He was going to throw up after all. In the half second before he did, in the half second he went on looking into the mirror, he saw those blue eyes disappear. But before that happened, there was suddenly the feeling of being two people, of being possessed, like the little girl in The Exorcist. Clearly, he felt a new mind inside his own mind and heard a thought not his own thought, but more like a voice from a radio. I've come through. I'm in the sky carriage. There was something else, but Eddie didn't hear it. He was too busy throwing up into the basin as quietly as he could. When he was done, before he had even wiped his mouth, something happened which had never happened to him before. For one frightening moment there was nothing, only a blank interval, as if a single line in a column of newsprint had been neatly and completely inked out. What is this? Eddie thought helplessly. What the hell is this? Excuse me. Then he had to throw up again. And maybe that was just as well. Whatever you might say against it, regurgitation had at least this much in its favor. As long as you were doing it, you couldn't think of anything else. I've come through. I'm in the sky carriage, the gunslinger thought, and a second later, he sees me in the mirror. Roland pulled back, did not leave, but pulled back like a child retreating to the furthest corner of a very long room. He went inside the sky carriage. He was also inside a man who was not himself, inside the prisoner. In the first moment, when he had been close to the front, it was the only way he could describe it. He had been more than inside, he had almost been the man. He felt the man's illness, whatever it was, and sensed that the man was about to retch. Roland understood that if he needed to, he could take control of this man's body. He would suffer his pains, would be ridden by whatever demon ape rode him, but if he needed to, he could. Or he could stay back here, unnoticed, When the prisoner's fit of vomiting had passed, the gunslinger leaped forward, this time all the way to the front. He understood very little about this strange situation, and to act in a situation one does not understand is to invite the most terrible consequences. But there were two things he needed to know, and he needed to know them so desperately that the needing outweighed any consequences which might arise. Was the door he came through from his own world still there? And if it was his physical self still there, collapsed, untenanted, perhaps dying or already dead, without his self's self to go on unthinkingly, running lungs and heart and nerves? Even if his body still lived, it might only continue to do so until night fell. Then the lobstrosities would come out to ask their questions and look for shore dinners. He snapped the head, which was for a moment his head, around in a fast, backward glance. The door was still there, still behind him. It stood open on his own world, its hinges buried in the steel of this peculiar privy. And yes, there he lay, Roland, the last gunslinger, lying on his side, his bound right hand on his stomach. I'm breathing, Roland thought. I'll have to go back and move me, but there are things to do first, things. He let go of the prisoner's mind and retreated, watching, waiting to see if the prisoner knew he was there or not. After the vomiting stopped, Eddie remained bent over the basin, eyes tightly closed. Blinked there for a second. Don't know what it was. Did I look around? He groped for the faucet and ran cool water, eyes still closed. He splashed it over his cheeks and brow when it could be avoided no longer. He looked up and into the mirror again. His own eyes looked back at him. There was no alien voices in his head, no feeling of being watched. You had a momentary fugue, Eddie, the great sage at Eminent Junkie advised him. A not uncommon phenomenon in one who was going cool turkey. Eddie glanced at his watch. An hour and a half to New York. The plane was scheduled to land at 4:05, but it was really going to be high noon. Showdown time. He went back to his seat. His drink was on the divider. He took two sips, and the stew came back to ask if she could do anything else for him. He opened his mouth to say no, and then there was another of those odd, blank moments. I'd like something to eat, please, the gunslinger said through Eddie Dean's mouth. We'll be serving a hot snack in. I'm really starving, though, the gunslinger said with perfect truthfulness. Anything at all, even a popkin. Popkin? The army woman frowned at him, and the gunslinger suddenly looked into the prisoner's mind. Sandwich. The word was as distant as the murmur in a conch shell. The sandwich, even, the gunslinger said. The army woman looked doubtful. Well, have some tuna fish. That would be fine, the gunslinger said, although he had never heard of tuna fish in his life. Beggars could not be choosers. You do look a little pale, the army woman said. I thought maybe it was air sickness. Pure hunger. She gave him a professional smile. I'll see what I can rustle up. Rustle? The gunslinger thought dazedly. In his own world, to rustle was a slang verb meaning to take a woman by force. Never mind. Food would come. He had no idea if he could carry it back through the doorway to the body which needed it so badly, but one thing at a time. One thing at a time. Rustle, he thought, and Eddie Dean's head shook as if in disbelief. The gunslinger retreated again. Nerves. The great oracle and eminent junkie assured him. Just nerves. All part of the cool turkey experience, little brother. But if nerves was what it was, how come he felt this odd sleepiness stealing over him? Odd because he should have been itchy, ditzy, feeling that urge to squirm and scratch that came before the actual shakes. Even if he had not been in Henry's cool turkey state, there was the fact that he was about to attempt bringing 2 pounds of coke through U.S. Customs, a felony punishable by no less than 10 years in federal prison, and he seemed to suddenly be having blackouts as well. Still, that feeling of sleepiness. He sipped at his drink again, then let his eyes slip shut. Why'd you black out? I didn't. Or she'd be running for all the emergency gear they carry. Blanked out then. It's no good either way. You never blanked out like that before in your life. Nodded out, yeah, but never blanked out. Something odd about his right hand, too. Seemed to throb vaguely as if he had pounded it with a hammer. He flexed it without opening his eyes. No ache, no throb, no blue bombardier's eyes. As for the blankouts, they were just a combination of going cold turkey and a good case of what the great oracle and eminent etc. would no doubt call the smuggler's blues. But I'm going to sleep, just the same, he thought. How about that? Henry's face drifted by him like an untethered balloon. Don't worry, Henry was saying. You'll be all right, little brother. You fly down here to the Nassau, check in at the Aquinas. There'll be a man come by Friday night, one of the good guys. He'll fix you, leave you enough stuff to take you through the weekend. Sunday night, he brings you the coke, and you give him the key to the safe deposit box. Monday morning, you do the routine just like Balazar said. This guy will play. He knows how it's supposed to go. Monday noon, you fly out, and with a face as honest as yours, you'll breeze through customs, and we'll be eating steak and sparks before the sun goes down. It's going to be a breeze, little brother. Nothing but a cool breeze. But it had been sort of a warm breeze after all. The trouble with him and Henry was they were like Charlie Brown and Lucy. The only difference was once in a while Henry would hold on to the football so Eddie could kick it. Not often, but once in a while. Eddie had even thought, while in one of his heroin dazes, that he ought to write Charles Schwartz a letter. Dear Mr. Schultz, he would say, you're missing a bet by always having Lucy pull the football up at the last second. She ought to hold it down there once in a while. Nothing Charlie Brown could ever predict, you understand. Sometimes she'd make hold it down for him to kick 3 or even 4 times in a row, then nothing for a month, then once, then nothing for 3 or 4 months, then once, and then nothing for 3 or 4 days, and then, you get the idea. That would really fuck the kid up, wouldn't it? Eddie knew it would really fuck the kid up. From experience, he knew it. One of the good guys, Henry had said. But the guy who showed up had been a sallow skinned thing with a British accent, a hairline mustache that looked like something out of a 1940s film noir, and yellow teeth that all leaned inward like the teeth of a very old animal trap. You have the key, senor? He asked, except in that British public school accent it came out sounding what you call what you called your last year of high school. The key's safe, Eddie said, if that's what you mean. Then give it to me. That's not the way it goes. You're supposed to have something to take me through the weekend. Sunday night, you're supposed to bring me something. I give you the key. Monday, you go into town and use it to get something else. I don't know what, 'cause that's not my business. Suddenly, there was a small, flat, blue automatic in the sallow skinned thing's hand. Why don't you just give it to me, senior? I will save time. It will save time and effort, and it will save your life. There was a deep steel in Eddie Dean, junkie or no junkie. Henry knew it. More important, Balthazar knew it. That was why he had been sent. Most of them thought he had gone because he was hooked through the bag and back again. He knew it. Henry knew it. Balthazar too. But only he and Henry knew he would have gone even if he was as straight as a stake. For Henry, Balthazar hadn't got quite that far in his figuring, but fuck Balthazar. Why don't you just put that thing away, you little scuzz? Eddie asked. Or do you maybe want Balthazar to send someone down here and cut your eyes out of your head with a rusty knife? The sallow thing smiled. The gun was gone like magic. In its place was a small envelope. He handed it to Eddie. Just a little joke, you know. If you say so. I see you Sunday night. He turned toward the door. I think you better wait. The sallow thing turned back, eyebrows raised. You think I won't go if I want to go? I think if you go and this is bad shit, I'll be gone tomorrow. Then you'll be in deep shit. The sallow thing turned sulky. It sat in the room's single easy chair while Eddie opened the envelope and spilled out a small quantity of brown stuff. It looked evil. He looked at the sallow thing. I don't know how it looks. It looks like shit, but that's just the cut, the sallow thing said. It's fine. Eddie tore a sheet of paper from the notepad on the desk and separated a small amount of the brown powder from the pile. He fingered it and then rubbed it into the roof of his mouth. A second later, he spat it into the wastebasket. You want to die? Is that it? You got a death wish? It's all there is. The sallow thing looked more sulky than ever. I have a reservation out tomorrow, Eddie said. This was a lie, but he didn't believe the sallow thing had the resources to check it. TWA, I did it on my own, just in case the contact happened to be a fuck up like you. I don't mind. It'll be a relief, actually. I wasn't cut out for this sort of work. The sallow thing sat and cogitated. Eddie sat and concentrated on not moving. He felt like moving. Felt like slipping and sliding, bipping and bopping, shucking and jiving, scratching his scratches and cracking his crackers. He even felt his eyes wanting to slide back to the pile of brown powder, although he knew it was poison. He had fixed at 10 that morning. The same number of hours had gone by since then. But if he did any of those things, the situation would change. The sallow thing was doing more than cogitating. It was watching him, trying to calculate the depth of him. I might be able to find something, it said at last. Why don't you try? Eddie said. But come 11, I turn out the light and put the do not disturb sign on the door, and anybody that knocks after I do that, I call the desk and say somebody's bothering me, send a security guy. You are a fuck, the sallow thing said in his impeccable British accent. No, Eddie said. A fuck is what you expected. I came with my legs crossed. You want to be here before 11 with something that I can use. It doesn't have to be great, just something I can use, or you will be one dead scuzz. The sallow thing was back long before 11. He was back by 9:30. Eddie guessed the other stuff had been in his car all along. A little more powder this time. Not white, but at least a dull ivory color, which was mildly hopeful. Eddie tasted. Seemed all right. Actually, better than all right. Pretty good. He rolled a bill and snorted. Well, then. Until Sunday, the sallow thing said briskly, getting to its feet. Wait, Eddie said, as if he were the one with the gun. In a way, he was. The gun was Balazar. Emilio Balazar was a high-caliber big shot in New York's wonderful world of drugs. Wait. The sallow thing turned and looked at Eddie as if he believed Eddie must be insane. For what? Well, I was actually thinking of you, Eddie said. If I get really sick from what I just put into my body, it's off. If I die, of course it's off. I was just thinking that if I only get a little sick, I might give you another chance. You know, like that story about how some kid rubs a lamp and gets 3 wishes. It will not make you sick. That's China White. If that's China White, Eddie Dean said, I'm Dwight Golden. Who? Never mind. The sallow thing sat down. Eddie sat by the motel room desk with the little pile of white powder nearby. The decon, or whatever it was, had long since gone down the John. On TV, the Braves were getting shellbacked by the Mets, courtesy of WTBS and the big satellite dish on the Aquinas Hotel roof. Eddie felt a faint sensation of calm which seemed to come before the back of his mind. Except where it was really coming from, he knew from what he had read in the medical journals, was from a bunch of living wires at the base of his spine, that place where heroin addiction takes place by causing an unnatural thickening of the nerve stem. Want to take a quick cure? He had asked Henry once. Break your spine, Henry? Your legs stop working, and so does your cock, but you stop needing the needle right away. Henry hadn't thought it was funny. In truth, Eddie hadn't thought it was funny either. When the only fast way you could get rid of the monkey on your back was to snap your spinal cord above the bunch of nerves, you were dealing with one heavy monkey. That was no capuchin, so cute little organ grinder mascot that was a big ol' mean baboon. Eddie began to sniffle. Okay, he said at last. It'll do. You can vacate the premises, Scuzz. The sallow thing got up. I have friends, he said. They could come in here and do things to you. You'd beg to tell me where that key is. Not me, champ, Eddie said. Not this kid. and smiled. He didn't know how the smile looked, but it must not have looked all that cheery because the sallow thing vacated the premises, vacated them fast, and vacated them without looking back. When Eddie Dean was sure he was gone, he cooked, fixed, and slept. As he was sleeping now, the gunslinger, somehow inside the man's mind, a man whose name he still didn't know, the lowling the prisoner thought of as the sallow thing, had not known it, and so he had never known it. Watched this as he had once watched plays as a child before the world had moved on. Or so he thought he watched, because plays were all he had ever seen. If he had ever seen a moving picture, he would have thought of that first. The things he did not actually see, he had been able to pluck from the prisoner's mind because the associations were close. It was odd about the name, though. He knew the name of the prisoner's brother, but not the name of the man himself. But of course, names were secret things, full of power. And neither of the things that mattered was the man's name. One was the weakness of the addiction, the other was the steel buried inside that weakness, like a good gun sinking in quicksand. This man reminded the gunslinger achingly of Cuthbert. Someone was coming. The prisoner, sleeping, did not hear. The gunslinger, not sleeping, did, and came forward again. Great, Jane thought. He tells me how hungry he is, and I fix something up for him because he's a little bit cute, and then he falls asleep on me. Then the passenger, a guy of about 20, tall, wearing clean, slightly faded blue jeans and a paisley shirt, opens his eyes and a little, and smiled at her. Thank you, Si, he said, or so it sounded, almost archaic, or foreign. Sleep talk, that's all, Jane thought. You're welcome. She smiled her best stewardess smile, sure he would fall asleep again and the sandwich would still be there uneaten when it was time for the actual meal service. Well, that was what they taught you to expect, wasn't it? She went back to the galley to catch a smoke. She struck the match, lifted it halfway to her cigarette, and there it stopped. Unnoticed, because that wasn't all they taught you to expect. I thought he was a little bit cute, mostly because of his eyes. His hazel eyes. But when the man in 3A had opened his eyes a moment ago, they hadn't been hazel. They had been blue. Not sweet, sexy blue like Paul Newman's eyes either, but the color of icebergs. Ow! The match had reached her fingertips, and she shook it out. Jane? Paula asked. You all right? Fine, daydreaming. She lit another match and this time did the job right. He had only taken a single drag when the perfectly reasonable explanation occurred to her. He wore contacts, of course, the kind that changed the color of your eyes. He had gone into the bathroom. He'd been in there for long enough for her to worry about him for being airsick. He had that pallid complexion and the look of a man who's not quite well. But he'd only been taking out his contact lenses, so he could nap more comfortably. Perfectly reasonable. You may feel something, a voice from her own not so distant past spoke suddenly. Some little tickle. You may see something, just a little bit wrong. Colored contact lenses. Jane Dorning personally knew over 24 people who wore contacts. Most of them worked for the airline. No one ever said anything about it, but she thought maybe one reason was they all sensed the passengers didn't like to see flight personnel wearing glasses. It made them nervous. Of all those people, she knew maybe 4 who had colored contacts. Ordinary contact lenses were expensive. Colored ones cost the earth. All of the people of Jane's acquaintances who cared to lay out that sort of money were women. All of them extremely vain. So what? Guys can be vain too. Why not? He's good looking. No, he wasn't. Cute, maybe, but that was as far as it went. And with the pallid complexion, he only made it to cute by the skin of his teeth. So why the colored contacts? Airline passengers are often afraid of flying. In a world where hijacking and drug smuggling had become facts of life, airline personnel are often afraid of passengers. The voice that had initiated these thoughts had been that of an instructor at flight school, a tough old battle axe who looked as if she could have flown the mail with wily posts, saying, "Don't ignore your suspicions. If you forget everything else you've learned about coping with potential or actual terrorists, remember this: don't ignore your suspicions. In some cases, you'll get a crew who'll say during the debriefing that they didn't have any idea until the guy pulled out a grenade and said, hang a left for Cuba, or everyone on the aircraft is going to join the jet stream." But in most cases, you get two or three different people, mostly flight attendants, which you women will be in less than a month, who say they felt something, some little tickle, a sense that the guy in 91C or the young woman in 5A was a little wrong. They felt something, but they did nothing. Did they get fired for that? Christ, no. You can't put a guy in restraints because you don't like the way he scratches his pimples. The real problem is they felt something and then forgot. The old battle axe had raised one blunt finger. Jane Dorning, along with her fellow classmates, had listened raptly as she said, "If you feel that little tickle, don't do anything. But that includes not forgetting, because there's always that one little chance that you just might be able to stop something before it gets started. Something like an unscheduled 12-day layover on the tarmac of some shit-pot Arab country. Just colored contacts, but thank ye, Sai. Sleep talk, or a muddled lapse into some other language?" She would watch, Jane decided, and she would not forget. Now, the gunslinger thought, now we'll see, won't we? He'd been able to come from his world into this body through the door on the beach. What he needed to find out was whether or not he could carry things back. No, not himself. He was confident that he could return through the door and re enter his own poisoned, sickening body at any time he should desire. But other things, physical things. Here, for instance, in front of him, was food, something the woman in the uniform had called a Tudor fish sandwich. The gunslinger had no idea what a Tudor fish was, but he knew a popkin when he saw it, although this one had looked curiously uncooked. His body needed to eat, and his body would need to drink, but more than either, his body needed some sort of medicine. It would die from the lobstrosity's bite without it. There might be such medicine in this world, in a world where carriages rode through the air far above where even the strongest eagle could fly. Anything seemed possible. But it would not matter how much powerful medicine there was here if he could carry nothing physical through the door. "You could live in this body, gunslinger," the voice of the man in black whispered deep inside his head. "Leave that piece of breathing meat over there for the lobster things. It's only a husk, anyway." He would not do that. For one thing, it would be the most murderous sort of thievery, because he would not be content to just be a passenger for long, looking out of this man's eyes like a traveler looking out of the coach window at the passing scenery. For another, he was Roland. If dying was required, he intended to die as Roland. He would die crawling toward the tower, if that was what was required. Then the odd, harsh practicality that lived beside the romantic in his nature, like a tiger with a roe, reasserted itself. There was no need to think of dying, with the experiment not yet made. He picked up the popkin. It had been cut in two halves. He had one in each hand. He opened the prisoner's eyes and looked out of them. No one was looking at him, although in the galley Jane Dorning was thinking about him, and very hard. Roland turned toward the door and went through, holding the popkin halves in his hands. First he heard the grinding roar of an incoming wave, next he heard the argument of many seabirds arising from the closest rocks as he struggled to a sitting position. Cowardly buggers were creeping up, he thought, and they would have been taking pecks out of me soon enough. Still breathing or no, they're nothing but vultures with a coat of paint. Then he became aware that one popkin half, the one in his right hand, had tumbled onto the hard, gray sand because he had been holding it with a whole hand when he came through the door, and now was, or had been, holding it in a hand which had suffered a 40% reduction. He picked it up clumsily, pinching it between his thumb and ring finger, brushed it as much of the sand from it as he could, and took a tentative bite. A moment later, he was wolfing it, not noticing the few bits of sandwich ground between his teeth. Seconds later, he turned his attention to the other half. It was gone in 3 bites. The gunslinger had no idea what a tuna fish was, only that it was delicious, and that seemed enough. In the plane, no one saw the tuna fish sandwich disappear. No one saw Eddie Dean's hands grasp the two halves of it tightly enough to make deep thumb indentations in the white bread. No one saw the sandwich fade to transparency, then disappear, leaving only a few crumbs. About 20 seconds after this happened, Jane Dorning snuffed her cigarette and crossed the head of the cabin. She got her book from her tote bag, but what she really wanted was another look at 3A. He appeared to be deeply asleep, but the sandwich was gone. Jesus, Jane thought. He didn't eat it, he swallowed it whole. And now he's asleep again? Are you kidding? Whatever was tickling at her about 3A, Mr. Now they're hazel, now they're blue, kept right on ticking. Something about him was not right. Something. Eddie Dean was awakened by contact at and landing. Eddie Dean was awakened by an announcement from the co-pilot that they should be landing at Kennedy International where the visibility was unlimited. The winds out of the west at 10 miles an hour and the temperature a jolly 70 degrees in 45 minutes or so. He had told them that, if he didn't get another chance, he wanted to thank them one and all for choosing Delta. He looked around and saw people checking their duty declaration cards and their proofs of citizenship coming in from Nassau, your driver's license, and a credit card with a stateside bank listed on it. Supposed to be enough, but most still carried passports, and Eddie felt the steel wires start to tighten inside of him. He still couldn't believe he had gone to sleep, and so soundly. He got up and went to the restroom. The bags of coke under his arms felt as if they were resting easily and firmly, fitting as nicely to the contours of his side as they had in the hotel room where a soft-spoken American named William Wilson had strapped them on. Following the strapping operation, the man whose name Poe had made famous, Wilson, had only looked blankly at Eddie when Eddie made some allusion to this. Handed over the shirt. Just an ordinary paisley shirt, a little faded, the sort of thing any frat boy might wear back on the plane following a short pre-exams holiday, except this one was specially tailored to hide unsightly bulges. You check everything once before you set, just to be sure, Wilson said, but you're going to be fine. Eddie didn't know if he was going to be fine or not, but he had another reason for wanting to use the John before the fasten seatbelt light came on. In spite of all temptation, and most of last night it hadn't been temptation but raging need, he had managed to hold on to the last bit of what the sallow thing had temerity to call China White. Clearing customs from Nassau wasn't like clearing customs from Haiti or Quincon or Bogota, but there were still people watching, trained people. He needed any and every edge he could get. If he could go in there a little cooled out, just a little, it might be the one thing to put him over the top. He snorted the powder, flushed the little twist of paper it had been in down the John, then washed his hands. Of course, if you make it, you'll never know, will you? He thought. No, he wouldn't, and wouldn't care. On his way back to his seat, he saw the stewardess, who had brought him the drink he had finished. She smiled at him. He smiled back, sat down, buckled his seatbelt, took out the flight magazine, turned the pages, and looked at pictures and words. Neither made any impression on them. That steel wire continued to tighten around his gut, and when the fastened seatbelt's light did come on, it took a double turn and cinched tight. The heroin had hit. He had the sniffles to prove it, but he sure couldn't feel it. One thing he did feel shortly before landing was another of those unsettling periods of blankness. Short, but most definitely there. The 727 banked over the water of Long Island Sound and started it. Jane Dorning had been in the business class gallery, helping Peter and Anne stow the last of the after-meal drink glasses when the guy who looked like a college kid went to the first-class bathroom. He was returning to his seat when she brushed aside the curtain between the business and first, and she quickened her step without even thinking about it, catching him with her smile, making him look up and smile back. His eyes were hazel again. All right,
All right, he went into the John and took them out before his nap. He went into the John and put them in again after. For Christ's sakes, Janey, you're being a goose. She wasn't, though. It was nothing she could put her finger on, but she was not being a goose. He's too pale. So what? Thousands of people are too pale, including your own mother, since her gallbladder went to hell. He had very arresting blue eyes. Maybe not as cute as the hazel contacts, but certainly arresting. So, why the bother and the expense? Because he likes designer eyes. Isn't that enough? No. Shortly before fastened seatbelts and final cross check, she did something she had never done before. She did it with that tough old battle axe of an instructor in mind. She filled a thermos bottle with hot coffee and put on the red plastic top without first pushing the stopper into the bottle's throat. She screwed the top on only until she felt it catch the first thread. Susie Douglas was making the final approach announcement, telling the geese to extinguish their cigarettes, telling them they would have to stow what they had taken out, telling them a Delta Gate agent would meet the flight, telling them to check and make sure they had their duty declaration cards and proof of citizenship, telling them it would now be necessary to pick up all cups, glasses, and speaker sets. I'm surprised we don't have to check to make sure they're dry, Jane thought distractedly. She felt her own steel wire wrapping itself around her guts, cinching them tight. Get my side, Jane said as Susie hung up the mic. Susie glanced at the thermos, then at Jane's face. Jane, are you sick? You look as white as a. I'm not sick. Get my side. I'll explain when you get back. Jane glanced briefly at the jump seats beside the left hand exit door. I want to ride shotgun. Jane, get my side. All right, Susie said. All right, Jane, no problem. Jane Dorning sat down in the jump seat closest to the aisle. She held the thermos in her hands and made no move to fasten the web harness. She wanted to keep the thermos in complete control, and that meant both hands. Susie thinks I flipped out. Jane hoped she had. If Captain McDonald lands hard, I'm going to have blisters all over my hands. She would risk it. The plane was dropping. The man in 3A, the man with the two-tone eyes and pale face, suddenly leaned down and pulled his traveling bag from under the seat. This is it, Jane thought. This is where he brings out the grenade, or the automatic weapon, or whatever the hell he's got. And the moment she saw it, the very moment, she was going to flip the red top off the thermos in her slightly trembling hands, and there was going to be one very surprised friend of Allah rolling around on the aisle floor of Delta Flight 901 while his skin boiled on his face. 3A unzipped the bag. Jane got ready. The gunslinger thought this man, prisoner or not, was probably better at the fine art of survival than any of the other men he had seen in the air carriage. The others were fat things, for the most part, and even those who looked reasonably fit also looked open, unguarded, their faces those of spoiled and cosseted children, the faces of men who would fight, eventually, but who would whine almost endlessly before they did. You could let their guts out onto their shoes, and their last expressions would not be rage or agony, but stupid surprise. The prisoner was better, but not good enough. Not at all. The army woman. She saw something. I don't know what, but she saw something wrong. She's awake to him in a way she's not to the others. The prisoner sat down, looked at a limp-covered book he thought of as a magazine, although who Magda might have been, or what she might have seen, mattered not a whit to Roland. The gunslinger did not want to look at a book, amazing as such things were. He wanted to look at the woman in the army uniform. The urge to come forward and take control was very great, but he held against it, at least for the time being. The prisoner had gone somewhere and had gotten a drug. Not the drug he himself took, nor one that would help cure the gunslinger's sick body, but one the people paid a lot of money for because it was against the law. He would give this drug to his brother, who would in turn give it to a man named Balazar. The deal would be complete when Balazar traded them the kind of drug they took for this one. If that was, the prisoner was able to correctly perform a ritual unknown to the gunslinger. And a world as strange as this must of necessity have many strange rituals. It was called clearing the customs. But the woman sees him. Could she keep him from clearing the customs? Roland thought the answer was probably yes, and then Gale. And if the prisoner was Galed, There would be no place to get the sort of medicine his infecting, dying body needed. He must clear the customs, Roland thought. He must. And he must go with his brother to this man Balazar. It's not in the plan. The brother won't like it, but he must. Because a man who dealt in drugs would either know a man or be a man who also cured the sick. A man who could listen to what was wrong and then maybe he must clear the customs, the gunslinger thought. The answer was so large and so simple, so close to him, that he very nearly did not see it at all. It was the drug the prisoner meant to smuggle in that would make clearing the customs so difficult. Of course, there might be some sort of oracle who might be consulted in the case of people who seem suspicious. Otherwise, Roland gleaned, the clearing ceremony would be simplicity itself, as crossing a friendly border was in his own world. One made the sign of fealty to the kingdom's monarch, the simple token gesture, and was allowed to pass. He was able to take things from the prisoner's world to his own. The Tudor fish Popkin proved that. He would take this bag of drugs as he had taken the Popkin. The prisoner would clear the customs, and then Roland would bring the bags of drugs back. Can you? Ah, there was a question disturbing enough to distract him from the view of the water below. They had gone over what looked like a huge ocean, and they were now turning back toward the coastline. As they did, the water grew steadily closer. The air carriage was coming down. Eddie's glance was brief, cursory, the gunslinger as rapt as a child seeing his first snowfall. He could take things from this world. That he knew. But bring them back again? That was a thing of which he as of yet had no knowing. He would have to find out. The gunslinger reached into the prisoner's pocket and closed the prisoner's fingers over a coin, and Roland went back through the door. The birds flew away when he sat up. They hadn't dared come as close this time. He ached, he was woozy and feverish, yet it was amazing how much even a little bit of nourishment had revived him. He looked at the coin he had brought back with him this time. It looked like silver, but the reddish tint at the edge suggested it was really made of some baser metal. On one side was a profile of a man whose face suggested nobility, courage, and stubbornness. His hair both curled at the base of the skull and pigged at the nape of the neck, suggesting a bit of vanity as well. He turned the coin over and saw something so startling it caused him to cry out in a rusty, croaking voice. On the back was an eagle, the device which had decorated his own banner in those dim days when there had still been kingdoms and banners to symbolize them. Time's short. Go back. Hurry. But he tarried a moment longer, thinking. It was harder to think inside this head. The prisoner's was far from clear, but it was, temporarily at least, a cleaner vessel than his own. To try the coin both ways was only half the experiment, wasn't it? He took one of the shells from the cartridge belt and folded it over the coin in his hand, and Roland stepped back through the door. The prisoner's coin was still there, firmly curled within the pocket at hand. He didn't have to come forward to check on the shell. He knew it hadn't made the trip. He came forward anyway, briefly, because there was one thing he had to know. He had to see. So he turned as if to adjust the little paper thing on the back of his seat. By all the gods that were ever there was paper everywhere in this world, and looked through the doorway. He saw his body collapsed as before, now with a fresh trickle of blood flowing through a cut on his cheek. The stone must have done it when he left himself and crossed over. The cartridge he had been holding, along with the coin, lay at the base of the door, on the sand. Still, enough was answered. The prisoner could clear the customs. The guards of the watch might search him from head to toe, from asshole to appetite and back again, and they'd find nothing. The gunslinger settled back, content, unaware at least for the time being that he still had not grasped the extent of his problem. The 727 came in low and smooth over the salt marshes of Long Island, leaving sooty trails of spent fuel behind. The landing gear came down with a rumble and a thump. 3A, the man with two-toned eyes, straightened up, and Jane actually saw, a snub-nosed Uzi in his hand before she realized it was nothing but his duty declaration card and a little zipper bag of the sort which men sometimes use to hold their passports. The plane settled like silk. Letting out a deep, shaking shudder, she tightened the red top on the thermos. Call me an asshole, she said in a low voice to Susie, buckling the crossover belts now that it was too late. She had told Susie what she suspected on the final approach, so Susie would be ready. You have every right. No, Susie said, you did the right thing. I overreacted, and dinner's on me. Like hell it is. Don't look at him. Look at me. Smile, Janey. Jane smiled, nodded. Wonderful. What in God's name was going on now? You were watching his hands, Susie said, and laughed. Jane joined in. I was watching what happened to his shirt when he bent over to get his bag. He's got enough stuff under there to stock a Woolworth's Notions Center. Only, I don't think he's carrying the kind of stuff you can buy at Woolworth's. Jane threw back her head and laughed again, feeling like a puppet. How do we handle it? Susie had 5 years seniority on her, and Jane, who only a minute ago had felt she had the situation under some desperate kind of control, now only felt glad to have Susie beside her. We don't. Tell the captain while we're taxiing in. The captain speaks to customs. Your friend there gets in line like everyone else, except then he gets pulled out of the line by some men who escort him to a little room. It's going to be the first in a very long succession of little rooms for him, I think. Jesus. Jane was smiling, but chills, alternately hot and cold, were racing through her. She had the pop release on her harness when the reverse thrusters began to wind down, handed the thermos to Susie, then got up and rapped on the cockpit door. Not a terrorist, but a drug smuggler. Thank God for small favors. Yet in a way she hated it. He had been cute. Not much, but a little. He still doesn't see, the gunslinger thought, with anger and dawning desperation. Gods! Eddie had been to get the papers he needed for the ritual, and when he looked up, the army woman was staring at him, her eyes bulging, her cheeks as wide as the paper things on the back of her seats, the silver tube with the red top, which he had at first taken for some kind of canteen, was apparently a weapon. She was holding it up between her breasts now. Roland thought in a moment or two she would either throw it or spin off the red top and shoot him with it. Then she relaxed and buckled in her harness, even though the thump told both the gunslinger and the prisoner the air carriage had already landed. She turned to the army woman she was sitting with and said something. The other woman laughed and nodded, but if that was a real laugh, the gunslinger thought, he was a river toad. The gunslinger wondered how the man whose mind had become a temporary home for the gunslinger's own caw could be so stupid. Some of it was what he was putting into his body, of course, one of this world's versions of devilweed. Some, but not all. He was not soft and unobservant like the others, but in time he might be. They are as they are because they live in the light, the gunslinger thought suddenly. The light of civilization you were taught to adore above all other things. They live in a world which has not moved on. If this is what people became in such a world, Roland was not sure he didn't prefer the dark. That was before the world moved on. People said his own world, and it was always said in tones of bereft sadness. But it was perhaps sadness without thought and without consideration. She thought he meant to grab a weapon when he bent down to get the papers. When she saw the papers, she relaxed and did what everyone else did before the carriage came down to the ground again. Now she and her friend are talking and laughing, but their faces, her face especially, the face of the woman with the metal tube, are not right. They are talking all right, but they are only pretending to laugh. And that is because what they are talking about is I/him. The air carriage was now moving along what seemed a long concrete road, one of many. Mostly he watched the women, but from the edges of his vision, the gunslinger could see other air carriages moving here and there along the other roads. Some lumbered, some moved with incredible speed, not like carriages at all, but like projections fired from guns or cannons preparing to leap into the air. As desperate as his own situation had become, part of him wanted very much to come forward and turn his head so he could see these vehicles as they leaped into the sky. They were man-made, but every bit as fabulous as the stories of the Grand Federaux, which had supposedly once lived in the distant and probably mythical kingdom of uh, of Garland, more fabulous perhaps simply because these were man made. The woman who had brought him the popkin unfastened her harness, this less than a minute since she had fastened it, and went forward to a small door. That's where the driver sits, the gunslinger thought. When the door was opened and she stepped in, he saw it apparently took 3 drivers to operate the air carriage, and even the brief glimpse he was afforded of what seemed like millions of dials and levers and lights made him understand why. The prisoner was looking at all but seeing nothing. Corp would have first sneered, then driven him through the nearest wall. The prisoner's mind was completely occupied with grabbing the bag under the seat and his light jacket from the overhead bin, and facing the ordeal of the ritual. The prisoner saw nothing, and the gunslinger saw everything. The woman thought him a thief or a madman. He, or perhaps it was I, yes, that's likely enough, did something to make her think that. She changed her mind, and then the other woman changed it back. Only now I think they know what's really wrong. They know going to try to profane the ritual. Then, in a thunderclap, he saw the rest of the problem. First, it wasn't just a matter of taking the bags into his world as he had the coin. The coin hadn't been stuck to the prisoner's body with the glue string that the prisoner had wrapped around and around his upper body to hold the bags tight to his skin. This glue string was only part of his problem. The prisoner hadn't missed the temporary disappearance of one coin among many, but when he realized that whatever it was he had risked his life for was suddenly gone, he was surely going to raise the racks. And what then? It was more than possible that the prisoner would begin to behave in a manner so irrational that it would get him locked away in a gale as quickly as being caught in the act of profanation. The loss would be bad enough, for the bags under his arms to simply melt away to nothing would probably make him think he really had gone mad. The air carriage, ox like now that it was on the ground, labored its way through a left turn. The gunslinger realized that he had no time for the luxury of further thought. He had to do more than come forward. He must make contact with Eddie Dean. Right now. Eddie tucked his declaration card and passport in his breast pocket. The steel wire was now turning steadily around his guts, sinking in deeper and deeper, making his nerves spark and sizzle, and suddenly a voice spoke in his head. Not a thought, a voice. Listen to me, fellow. Listen carefully. And if you would remain safe, let your face show nothing which might further rouse the suspicion of those army women. God knows they're suspicious enough already. Eddie first thought he was still wearing the airline earphones and picking up some weird transmissions from the cockpit, but the airline headphones had been picked up 5 minutes ago. His second thought was that someone was standing beside him and talking. He almost snapped his head to the left, but that was absurd. Like it or not, the raw truth was that the voice had come from inside his head. Maybe he was receiving some sort of transmission, AM, FM, or VHF on the fillings in his teeth. He had heard of such things. Straighten up, maggot. They're suspicious enough without you looking as if you've gone crazy. Eddie sat up fast, as if he'd been whacked. That voice wasn't Henry's, but it was so much like Henry's when they had been just a couple of kids growing up in the projects. Henry, 8 years older, the sister who had been between them now only a ghost of a memory. Selina had been struck and killed by a car when Eddie was 2 and Henry was 10. The rasping tone of the command came out whenever Henry saw him doing something that might end with Eddie's occupying a pine box long before his time, as Selina had. What in the blue fuck is going on here? You're not hearing voices that aren't there. The voice inside your head, his head returned. No, not Henry's voice, older, drier, stronger, but like Henry's voice. And impossible not to believe. That's the first thing. You're not going crazy. I am another person. This is telepathy? Eddie was vaguely aware that his face was completely expressionless. He thought that, under the circumstances, that ought to qualify him for the Best Actor of the Year Academy Award. He looked out the window and saw the plane closing in on the Delta section of the Kennedy's International Arrivals Building. I don't know that word, but I do know that those army women know you are carrying. There was a pause, a feeling, odder beyond telling, of phantom fingers rummaging through his brain as if he were a living card catalog. Heroin or cocaine. I can't tell which except it must be cocaine because you're carrying the one you don't take to buy the one you do. What army women? Eddie muttered in a low voice. He was completely unaware he was speaking aloud. What the hell are you talking about? The feeling of being slapped once more, so real he felt his head ring with it. Shut your mouth, you damn jackass. All right, Christ. Now the feeling of rummaging fingers again. Army stewardesses, the alien voice replied. Do you understand me? I have no time to call on your every thought, prisoner. What did you? Eddie began, then shut his mouth. What did you call me? Never mind. Just listen. Time is very, very short. They know. The army stewardesses know you have this cocaine. How could they? That's ridiculous. I don't know how they came by their knowledge, and it doesn't matter. One of them told the drivers. The drivers will tell whatever priests perform this ceremony, this clearing of customs. The language of the voice in his head was arcane. The terms so off kilter they were almost cute, but the message came through loud and clear, although his face remained expressionless. Eddie's teeth came together with a painful click, and he drew a hot little hiss in through them. The voice was saying the game was over. He hadn't even gotten off the plane, and the game was already over. But this wasn't real. No way this could be real. It was just in his mind, doing a paranoid little jig at the last minute, that was all. He would ignore it. Just ignore it, and it would go away. You will not ignore it, or you will go to jail, and I will die, the voice roared. Who in the name of God are you? Eddie asked reluctantly. Fearfully, and inside his head, he heard someone, or something, let out a deep and gusty sigh of relief. He believes, the gunslinger thought. Thank all the gods that are or ever were, he believes. The plane stopped. The fasten seatbelts light went out. The jetway rolled forward and bumped against the forward port of the forward port door with a gentle thump. They had arrived. There is a place where you can put it while you perform the clearing of customs, the voice said. A safe place. Then, when you are away, you can get it again and take it to this man Balazar. People were standing up now, getting things out of the overhead bins and trying to deal with coats which were, according to the cockpit announcement, too warm to wear. Get your bag, get your jacket, then go into the privy again. Oh, bathroom. Head. If they think I've got dope, they'll think I'm trying to dump it. But Eddie understood that part didn't matter. They wouldn't exactly break down the door because they might scare the passengers, and they'd know you couldn't flush 2 pounds of coke down an airline toilet and leave no trace. Not unless the voice was really telling the truth. That there was some safe place. But how could there be? Never mind, damn you, move! Eddie moved, because he had finally come alive to the situation. He was not seeing all Roland, with his many years and his training of mingled torture and precision, could see. But he could see the faces of the stews, the real faces, the ones behind the smiles and the helpful passing of garment bags and cartons stowed in the forward closets. He could see the way their eyes flicked to him, whiplash quick again and again. He got his bag, he got his jacket. The door to the jetway had been opened and people were already moving up the aisle. The door to the cockpit was open, and here was the captain almost smiling, but also looking at the passengers in first class who were still getting their things together, spotting him. No, targeting him, and looking away again, nodding to someone tousling a youngster's head. He was cold now cold turkey. Not cold turkey, just cold. He didn't need the voice in his head to make him cold. Cold. Sometimes that was okay. You just had to be careful you didn't get so cold you froze. Eddie moved forward, reached the point where a left turn would take him into the jetway, and then suddenly put his hand to his mouth. I don't feel well, he murmured. Excuse me. He moved the door to the cockpit, which slightly blocked the door to the first class head, and opened the bathroom door on the right. I'm afraid you'll have to exit the plane, the pilot said sharply as Eddie opened the bathroom door. I believe I'm going to vomit, and I don't want to do it on your shoes, Eddie said, or mine either. A second later, he was in with the door locked. The captain was saying something. Eddie couldn't make it out, didn't want to make it out. The important thing was it was just talk, not yelling. He had been right. No one was going to start yelling with maybe 250 passengers still waiting to deplane from the single forward door. He was in. He was temporarily safe. But what good was it going to do him? If you're there, he thought, you better do something very quick, whoever you are. For a terrible moment, there was nothing at all. There was a short moment, but in Eddie Dean's head it seemed to stretch out almost forever, like the Bonomo's Turkish taffy Henry had sometimes brought him in the summer when they were kids. If he were bad, Henry would beat the shit out of him. If he were good, Henry bought him Turkish taffy. That was the way Henry handled his heightened responsibilities during summer vacation. God, oh Christ, I imagined it all. Oh, Jesus, how crazy could I have been? Get ready, a grim voice said. I can't do it alone. I can come forward, but I can't make you come through. You have to do it with me. Turn around. Eddie was suddenly seeing through two pairs of eyes, feeling with two sets of nerves. But not all the nerves of this other person were here. Parts of the other were gone, freshly gone, screaming with pain, sensing with 10 senses, thinking with 2 brains, his blood beating with 2 hearts. He turned around. There was a hole in the sky of the bathroom, a hole that looked like a doorway. Through it, he could see a gray, grainy beach, waves the color of old athletic socks breaking upon it. He could hear the waves. He could smell salt, a smell as bitter as tears in his nose. Go through. Someone was thumping on the door to the bathroom, telling him to come out, that he must deplane at once. Go through, damn you! Eddie, moaning, stepped toward the doorway, stumbled, and fell into another world. He got slowly to his feet, aware that he had cut his right palm on the edge of a shell. He looked stupidly at the blood welling across his lifeline, then saw another man rising slowly to his feet on his right. Eddie recoiled, his feeling of disorientation and dreamy dislocation suddenly supplanted by sharp terror. This man was dead and didn't know it. His face was gaunt, the skin stretched over the bones on his face like strips of cloth wound around slim angles of metal, almost to the point where the cloth must tear itself open. The man's skin was livid save for hectic spots of red high on each cheekbone, on the neck below, the angle of the jaw on either side, and a single circular mark between the eyes, like a child's effort to replicate a Hindu caste symbol. Yet his eyes, blue, steady, and sane, were alive and full of terrible and tenacious vitality. He wore dark clothes of some homespun material. The shirt, its sleeves rolled up, was a black, faded, almost to gray. The pants, something that looked like blue jeans. Gun belts crisscrossed his hips, but the loops were almost all empty. The holsters held guns that looked like 45s, but 45s of an incredibly antique vintage. The smooth wood of their hand grips seemed to glow with their own inner light. Eddie, who didn't know he had any intention of uh, speaking anything to say, heard himself saying something nevertheless. Are you a ghost? Not yet, the man with the guns croaked. The devil weed, cocaine, whatever you call it. Take off your shirt. Your arms. Eddie had seen them. The arms of the man who looked like the extravagant sort of gunslingers one would only see in a spaghetti western, were glowing with lines of bright, baleful red. Eddie knew well enough what lines like that meant. They meant blood poisoning. They meant the devil was gonna be more than breathing up your ass. He was already crawling up the sewers that led to your pumps. Never mind my fucking arms, the pallid apparition told him. Take off your shirt and get rid of it. He heard waves. He heard the lonely hoot of wind that knew no obstruction. He saw this mad, dying man and nothing else but desolation, yet from behind he heard the muttering voices of deplaning passengers and a steady, muffled pounding. Mr. Dean! That voice, he thought, is in another world, not really doubting it, just trying to pound it through his head the way you pound a nail through a thick piece of mahogany. You'll really have to. You can't. You can leave it. Pick it up later, the gunslinger croaked. Gods, don't you understand? I have to talk here. It hurts. And there's no time, you idiot. There were men Eddie would have killed for using such a word, but he had an idea that he might have a job killing this man, even though the man looked like killing might do him good. Yet he sensed the truth in those blue eyes. All questions were cancelled in their mad glare. Eddie began to unbutton his shirt. His first impulse was to simply tear it off like Clark Kent while Lewis Lane was tied to a railroad track or something, but that was no good in real life. Sooner or later you had to explain those missing buttons. So he slipped them through the loops while the pounding behind him went on. He yanked the shirt out of his jeans, pulled it off, and dropped it, revealing the strapping tape across his chest. He looked like a man in the last stages of recovery from badly fractured ribs. He snapped a glance behind him and saw an open door. Its bottom jam had dragged a fan shape in the gray grit of the beach when someone, the dying man presumably, had opened it. Through the doorway he saw the first class head, the basin of the mirror, and in its own his own desperate face, black hair spilled across his brow over his hazel eyes. In the background he saw the gunslinger, the beach, and the soaring seabirds that screeched and squabbled over God knew what. He pawed at the tape, wondering how to start, how to find a loose end, and dazed sort of hopelessly settled over him. This was the way a deer or a rabbit must feel when it got halfway across the country road and turned its head only to be fixated by the oncoming glare of headlights. It had taken William Wilson, the man whose name Poe had made famous, 20 minutes to strap him up. They they would have made the door to the first class bathroom open in 5, 7 at most. I can't get this shit off, he told the swaying man in front of him. I don't know who you are or where I am, but I'm telling you, there's too much tape and too little time. Dear, the co-pilot suggested Captain MacDonald ought to lay off pounding on the door when MacDonald, in his frustration at 3A's lack of response, began to do so. Where is he going to go? Deer asked. What's he going to do? Flush himself down the John? He's too big. But if he's carrying, MacDonald began. Deer, who had found himself used to cocaine on more than Deer, who had self-used cocaine on more than a few occasions, said, if he's carrying, he's carry heavy. He can't get rid of it. Turn off the water, MacDonald snapped suddenly. Already have. The navigator, who had also tooted more than his flute on occasion, said, but I don't think it matters. You can dissolve what goes into the holding tanks, but you can't make it not there. They were clustered around the bathroom door, with its occupied sign glowing jeeringly, all of them speaking in low tones. The DEA guys drain it, draw off the sample, and the guys hung. You could always say something came in before and dumped it, MacDonald replied. His voice was gaining a raw edge. He didn't want to be talking about this. He wanted to be doing something about it. Even though he was acutely aware that the geese were still filing out, many looking with more than ordinary curiosity at the flight deck crew and the stewardesses gathered around the bathroom door. For their part, the crew were actually aware that an act that was, well, overly overt could provoke the terrorist boogeyman that now lurked in the back of every air traveler's mind. MacDonald knew that his navigator and flight engineer were right. He knew the stuff was apt to be in plastic bags with the scuzzballs prints on them, and yet he felt alarm bells going off in his mind. Something was not right about this. Something inside of him kept screaming, fast one, as if the fellow from 3A were a riverboat gambler with palmed aces he was all ready to play. He's not trying to flush the John, Susie Douglas said. He's not even trying to run the basin faucets. We'd hear them sucking air if he was. I hear something, but... Leave, Donald said curtly. His eyes flicked to Jane Dorning. You too. We'll take care of this. Jane turned to go, cheeks burning. Susie said quietly, Jane bird-dogged him, and I spotted the bulges under his shirt. I think we'll stay, Captain MacDonald. If you want to bring charges of insubordination, you can, but I want you to remember that you may be raping the hell out of what could be a really big DEA bust. Their eyes locked, flint sparking off steel. Susie said, I've flown with you 70, 80 times, Mac. I'm trying to be your friend. MacDonald looked at her a moment longer, then nodded. Stay then. But I want both of you back a step toward the cockpit. He stood on his toes, looked back, and saw the end of the line now just emerging from the tourist class into business. 2 minutes, maybe 3. He turned to the gate agent at the mouth of the hatch, who was watching them closely. He must have sensed some sort of problem because he had unholstered his walkie-talkie and was holding it in his hand. Tell him I want custom agents up here, MacDonald said quietly into the navigator. 3 or 4. Armed. Now. The navigator made his way through the line of passengers, excusing himself with an easy grin, and spoke quietly to the gate agent, who raised his walkie-talkie to his mouth and spoke quietly into it. MacDonald, who had never put anything stronger than aspirin into his system in his entire life, and that only rarely turned a deer, His lips were pressed into a thin white line like a scar. As soon as the last of the passengers are off, we're breaking that shithouse door open, he said. I don't care if customs is here or not. Do you understand? Roger, Dear said, and watching the tail of the line make its way into first class. Get my knife, the gunslinger said. It's in my purse. He gestured toward a cracked leather bag laying in the sand. It looked more like a big pack sack than a purse, the kind of thing you expected to see hippies carrying as they made their way along the Appalachian Trail, getting high on nature, and maybe a bomber joint every now and then. Except this looked like the real thing, not just a prop for some airhead self image, something that had done years and years of hard, maybe desperate traveling. Gestured, but did not point. Couldn't point. Eddie realized why the man had a swatch of dirty shirt wrapped around his hand. Some of his fingers were gone. Get it, he said. Cut through the tape. Try not to cut yourself. It's easy to do. You have to be careful, but you'll have to move fast just the same. There isn't much time. I know that, Eddie said, and knelt on the sand. None of this was real. That was it. That was the answer. As Henry Dean, the great sage and eminent junkie, would have put it, flip flop, hippity hop, off your rocker and over the top. Life's a fiction and the world's a lie, so put on some credence and let's get high. None of it was real. It was all just an extraordinarily vivid nodder, so the best thing was just to ride low and go with the flow. It sure was a vivid nodder. He was reaching for the zipper, or maybe it would be a Velcro strip or on the man's purse. When he saw it was held together by a crisscross pattern of rawhide thongs, some of which had broken and been carefully reknotted small enough so that they still slid through the grometed's eyelets. Eddie pulled the drag knot at the top, spread the bag's opening, and found the knife beneath the slightly damp package. There was a piece of shirting tied around the bullets. Just the handle was enough to take his breath away. It was the true mellow gray white of pure silver, engraved with a complex series of patterns that caught the eye, drew it. Pain exploded in his ear, roared across his head, and momentarily puffed a red cloud across his vision. He fell clumsily over the open purse, struck the sand, and looked up at the pale man in the cut-down boots. This was no nodder. The blue eyes blazing from the dying face were the eyes of all truth. Admire it later, prisoner, the gunslinger said. For now, just use it. He could feel his ear throbbing, swelling. Why do you keep calling me that? Cut the tape, the gunslinger said grimly. If they break into yon privy, while you're still over here, I've got a feeling you're going to be here for a very long time, and with a corpse for company before long. Eddie pulled the knife out of the scabbard. Not old, more than ancient. The blade, honed almost to the point of invisibility, seemed to be all age caught in metal. Yeah, it looks sharp, he said, and his voice wasn't steady. The last passengers were filing out of the jetway. One of them, a lady of some 70 summers with that exquisite look of confusion which only first-time flyers with too many years or too little English seem capable of wearing, stopped to show Jane Dorning all her tickets. How will I ever find my plane to Montreal? She asked. And what about my bags? Do they do my customs here or there? There will be a gate agent at the top of the jetway who can give you all the information you need, ma'am, Jane said. Well, I don't see why you can't give me the information I need, the old woman said. That jetaway thing is still full of people. Move on, please, madam, Captain MacDonald said. We have a problem. Well, pardon me for living, the old woman said huffily. I guess I just fell off the hearse. And strode past them, nose tilted like the nose of a dog scenting a fire still some distance away, tote bag clutched in one hand, ticket folded, with so many boarding pass stubs sticking out of it that one might have been tempted to believe the lady had been most of the way around the globe, changing planes at every stop along the way. And the other, there's a lady who may never fly Delta's big jets again, Susie murmured. I don't give a fuck if she flies stuff down the front of Superman's jockeys, MacDonald said. She's the last. Jane darted past them, glanced at the seats in business class, then poked. She the last? Jane darted past them, glanced at the seats in business class, and poked her head into the main cabin. It was deserted. She came back and reported the plane empty. MacDonald turned to the jetway and saw two uniformed custom agents fighting their way through the crowd, excusing themselves, but not bothering to look back at the people they jostled aside. The last of these was the old lady, who dropped her tickets folder. Papers flew and fluttered everywhere, and she shrilled after them like an angry crow. Okay, McDonald said. You guys stop right there. Sir, we're federal customs officers. That's right. And I requested you, and I'm glad you came so fast. Now you just stand right there, because this is my plane, and the guy in there is one of my geese. Once he's off the plane and into the jetway, he's your goose, and you can cook him any way you want. He nodded to Deer. I'm going to give the son of a bitch one more chance, and then we're going to break the door in. Okay by me, Deer said. McDonald whacked on the bathroom door with the heel of his hand and yelled, Come on out, my friend. I'm done asking. There was no answer. Okay, McDonald said. Let's do it. Dimly, Eddie heard an old woman say, Well, pardon me for living. I guess I just fell off the hearse. He had parted half the strapping tape. When the old woman spoke, his hand jerked a little and he saw a trickle of blood run down his belly. Shit, Eddie said. Can't be helped now, the gunslinger said in his hoarse voice. Finish the job. Or does the sight of blood make you sick? Only when it's my own, Eddie said. The tape had started just above his belly. The higher he cut, the harder it got to see. He got another 3 inches or so and almost cut himself again when he heard McDonald speaking to the customs agent. Okay, you guys, stop right there. I can finish and maybe cut myself wide open, or you can try, Eddie said. I can't see what I'm doing. My fucking chin's in the way. The gunslinger took the knife in his left hand. The hand was shaking. Watching that blade, honed to a suicidal sharpness, shaking like that, made Eddie extremely nervous. Maybe I better chance it Wait. The gunslinger stared fixedly at his left hand. Eddie didn't exactly believe in telepathy, but he had never exactly believed in it either. Nevertheless, he felt something now, something as real and palpable as the heat bake out of an oven. After a few seconds, he realized what it was, the gathering of this strange man's will. How the hell can he be dying if I can feel the force of him that strongly? The shaking hand began to steady down. Soon it was barely shivering. After no more than 10 seconds, it was as solid as a rock. Now, the gunslinger said. He took a step forward, raised the knife, and Eddie felt something else baking off him. Rancid fever. Are you left-handed? Eddie asked. No, the gunslinger said. Oh, Jesus, Eddie said, and decided he might feel better if he closed his eyes for a moment. He heard the harsh whisper of the masking tape parting. There, the gunslinger said, stepping back. Now pull it off as far as you can. I'll get the back. No polite little knocks on the bathroom door now. This was a hammering fist. The passengers are out, Eddie thought. Sorry. Holy hell, that hurt. One moment. Okay. Sorry, my foot got ran over and that kind of hurt, so that came out weird. We will go back to that. Where was I? Um Now I lost my place cuz that really hurt. Did y'all hear anything? Maybe at least maybe you didn't hear it. That was loud though, kind of. Like not loud. I guess it was loud because I was feeling it. You know how like when you feel something and you can like hear it but you're not really hearing. Never mind. Doesn't matter. Anyway, where was I? Um There, the gunslinger said, stepping back. Now pull it off as fast as you can and I'll get the bat. No polite little knocks on the bathroom door now. This was a hammering fist. The passengers are out, Eddie thought. No more Mr. Nice Guy. Oh, shit. Come on out, my friend. I'm done asking. Yank it, the gunslinger growled. Eddie grabbed a thick tab of strapping tape in each hand and yanked as hard as he could. It hurt. Hurt like hell. Stop belly aching, he thought. Things could be worse. You could be hairy-chested like Henry. He looked down and saw a red band of irritated skin about 7 inches wide across his sternum. Just above the solar plexus was the place he had been poked himself. Blood welled in a dimple and ran down his navel in a scarlet runnel. Beneath his armpits, the bag of dope now dangled like badly tied saddlebags. Okay, the muffled voice beyond the bathroom door said to someone else. Eddie lost the rest of it in the unexpected riptide of pain across his back, and the gunslingers unceremoniously tore the rest of the girdle from him. He bit down against a scream. Put your shirt on, the gunslinger said. His face, which Eddie had thought as pallid as the face of a living man could become, was now the color of ancient ashes. He held the girdle of tape, now sticking to itself in a meaningless tangle, the big bags of white stuff looking like strange cocoons in his left hand, then tossed it aside. Eddie saw fresh blood seeping through the makeshift bandage on the gunslinger's right hand. Do it fast. There was a thudding sound. This wasn't someone pounding for admittance. Eddie looked up in time to see the bathroom door shudder, to see the lights in their flicker. They were trying to break it in. He picked his shirt up with his fingers, then suddenly seemed too large and too clumsy. The left sleeve was turned inside out. He tried to stuff it back through the hole. Got his hand stuck for a moment, then yanked it out so hard he pulled the sleeve back again with it. Thud. The bathroom door shivered again. Gods, how can you be so clumsy? The gunslinger moaned, and rammed his own fist into the left sleeve of Eddie's shirt. Eddie grabbed the cuff as the gunslinger pulled back. Now the gunslinger held the shirt for him, as a butler might hold a coat for his master. Eddie put it on and groped for the lowest button. Not yet, the gunslinger barked, and tore another piece away from his own diminishing shirt. Wipe your gut. Eddie did the best he could. The dimple where the knife had actually pierced his skin was still welling blood. The blade was sharp, all right. Sharp enough. He dropped the bloody wad of the gunslinger's shirt on the sand and buttoned his shirt. Thud. This time, the door did more than shudder. It buckled in its frame. Looking through the door on the beach, Eddie saw the bottle of the liquid soap fall from where it had been standing beside the basin. It landed on his zipper bag. He had meant to stuff his shirt, which was now buttoned, and buttoned straight for a wonder, into his pants. Suddenly, a better idea struck him. He unbuckled his belt instead. There was no time for that, the gunslinger realized, and was trying to scream and was unable. The door only got one hit left in it. I know what I'm doing, Eddie said, hoping he did, and stepped back through the doorway between the worlds, unsnapping his jeans and ranking the zipper down as he went. After one desperate, despairing moment, the gunslinger followed him, physical and full of hot physical ache at one moment, nothing but cool caw in Eddie's head in the next. One more, MacDonald said grimly, and Deer nodded. Now that all the passengers were out of the jetway, as well as the plane itself, the customs agent had drawn their weapons. Now! The two men drove forward and hit the door together. It flew open, a chunk of it hanging for a moment from the lock and then dropping to the floor. And there sat Mr. 3A with his pants down around his knees and the tails of his faded paisley shirt concealing, barely, his jack handle. Well, it sure does look like we caught him in the act, Captain MacDonald thought warily. Only trouble is, the act we caught him in wasn't against the law, last I heard. Suddenly, he could feel the throb in his shoulder where he had hit the door. What, 3 times? 4? Out loud, he barked. What in the hell's name are you doing in there, mister? Well, I was taking a crap, 3A said. But if all you guys got a bad problem, I guess I could wipe myself in the terminal. And I suppose you didn't hear us, smart guy. Couldn't reach the door. 3A put out his hand to demonstrate, and although the door was now hanging askew against the wall to his left, MacDonald could see his point. I suppose I could have gotten up, but I had a desperate situation on my hands. Except it wasn't exactly on my hands, if you get my drift. Nor did I want it to be on my hands, if you catch my further drift. 3A smiled, a winning, slightly daffy smile which looked to Captain MacDonald approximately as real as a $9 bill. Listening to him, you'd think no one had ever taught him the simple trick of leaning forward. Get up, MacDonald said. Be happy to, if you could just move the ladies back a little. 3A smiled charmingly. I know it's outdated in this day and age, but I can't help it. I'm modest. Fact is, I've got a lot to be modest about. He held up his left hand, thumb and forefinger roughly half an inch apart, and winked at Jane Dorning, who blushed bright red and immediately disappeared up the jetway, closely followed by Susie. You don't look modest, Captain MacDonald thought. You look like a cat that just got the cream. That's what you look like. When the stews were out of sight, 3A stood and pulled up his shorts and jeans. He then reached for the flush button, and Captain MacDonald promptly knocked his hand away, grabbed his shoulders, and pivoted him toward the aisle. Deere hooked a restraining hand into the back of his pants. Don't get personal, Eddie said. His voice was light and just right. He thought so anyway, but inside everything was in freefall. He could feel the other, feel him clearly. He was inside his mind, watching him closely, standing steady, meaning to move in if Eddie fucked up. God, it all had to be a dream, didn't it? Didn't it? Stand still, Deere said. Captain MacDonald peered into the toilet. No shit, he said. And when the navigator let out a bray of involuntary laughter, MacDonald glared at him. Well, you know how it is, Eddie said. Sometimes you get lucky and it's just a false alarm. I let off a couple of real rippers, though. I mean, we're talking swamp gas. If you lit a match in here 3 minutes ago, you could have roasted a Thanksgiving turkey, you know? Must have been something I ate before I got on the plane. Get rid of him, MacDonald said. And Deere, still holding Eddie by the back of the pants, propelled him out of the plane and onto the jetway, where each customs officer took one arm. Hey, Eddie cried. I want my bag and I want my jacket. Oh, we want you to have all your stuff, one of the officers said, his breath heavy with the smell of Maalox and stomach acid puffed against Eddie's face. We're very interested in your stuff. Now let's go, little buddy. Eddie kept telling them to take it easy, mellow out. He could walk just fine. But he thought later the tips of his shoes only touched the floor of the jetway 3 or 4 times between 727's hatch and the exit to the terminal, where 3 more customs officers and half a dozen airport security cops stood. The customs guy waiting for Eddie, the cop holding back a small crowd that stared at him with uneasy, avid interest as he was led away. You didn't hear it, Tobin? That's good. I'm glad you did. Oh, I guess like maybe I didn't hear it. I just like heard it in my head. Anyway, it hurt. It hurt like hell. That hurt really bad. I might have broken a toe, but that's okay. All right. I am deciding. We made it through chapter 3. Okay, so this book, like I said, he has sections and then he has chapters. Okay, within that, and then he has sections within the chapters. So we're still in The Prisoner, but we're on chapter 4 of The Prisoner. And I'm deciding whether I should keep reading or we should pick up here next time. Let's see. I think it's like 40 more pages to chapter. Well, let me see how many are in this before I decide, before we get to the next section. And then that would be chapter 5. Oh, I should stop. And then next week we will do chapter 4 and 5. And then we'll be done with the section called The Prisoner next week. All right. Tobin, I want to know what today's reading has done to your theory. By the way. Okay, so because I'm going to go ahead and stop here, I'm gonna go check on my foot, and I'm gonna let the dogs outside. Um, and I'm gonna start some of the cooking, and then I will probably stream this evening. So, if you guys are around, if everyone gets busy and they're doing other stuff, I probably will not stream, but it is likely I will stream later. So, once again, thank you for coming. Thank you all for participating in book club with me, and I shall see you later, pretty shiny peoples.